Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never told this story outside a few close family members, but it's been 15 years and it still messes with my head, so I guess it's time to put it out there. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw. It was early August 2008, just after sunset on one of those Iowa nights where the heat doesn't break even after dark. I was living on our small farm about 7 miles outside town. If you've never been to rural Iowa, picture flatland as far as you can see, with cornfields stretching in every direction like a maze. Our little farmhouse and barn sat at the end of a long gravel road, pretty much isolated from everything. The nearest neighbor was almost a mile away. That night was stupid hot, the kind where your shirt sticks to your back the moment you step outside. I remember walking out to check on our livestock before bed, something I did every night. We had about 20 head of cattle, some chickens and 2 farm dogs, an Australian shepherd named Blue and a mutt we called Rusty. It was probably around 10:30 at night. The yard light cast this weak yellow glow that barely reached the barn. I was just making sure the cattle had water for the night and that everything was secure, normal routine stuff. I remember swatting mosquitoes away from my face and thinking about how I needed to fix the screen door on the porch the next day. The first thing I noticed was how the crickets suddenly stopped chirping. It wasn't gradual, it was like someone flipped a switch and all sound just cut off. You don't realize how loud crickets are until they go silent. That's when I noticed the cattle. They were all bunched together at the far end of the pasture, heads up and alert, staring in the same direction, toward the fence line that separated our property from the neighbor's cornfield. Blue and Rusty were acting weird too. They'd been following me around like usual, but suddenly they went completely stiff. Blue's ears were pricked forward, and Rusty started doing this low growl I'd never heard before. The hair on their backs stood straight up. I froze, wondering if it was a coyote or maybe someone trespassing. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps moving along our fence line. Not quick steps like a person walking, but slow, deliberate footsteps that made a thud you could feel in your chest. Each step had weight behind it. I squinted into the darkness, trying to see what was making that sound. The yard light didn't reach that far, but whatever it was had to be moving toward the light because the footsteps were getting louder. I felt rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. I just stood there watching the darkness, waiting. Then it stepped into the dim edge of the light. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive, way taller than any person I'd ever seen, 7 feet at minimum, maybe closer to 8. It was walking upright on 2 legs, but this was definitely not a human. Its entire body was covered in dark, uneven hair, not fur like an animal, but hair that hung longer on its arms and shoulders. The chest was broad and powerful looking, and its arms were proportionally too long, swinging with each step in this smooth, heavy stride. Its head sat directly on its shoulders without much of a neck, sloping from a heavy brow. I couldn't make out details of the face at first, just the silhouette of this enormous figure moving with purpose along our fence line. The dogs were freaking out. Blue had retreated behind me, pressing against my legs and whining, while Rusty backed up toward the porch. Neither one was barking, which was weird because they'd bark at literally anything: delivery trucks, distant coyotes, even falling branches. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, wearing some kind of costume, but no costume could move that naturally, and nobody I knew could fake that kind of size or weight. Each footstep made a heavy thud on the ground that you could feel through your boots. The creature approached our barbed wire fence that separated the pasture from the neighbor's corn. I watched as it reached out and gripped one of the wooden fence posts with what I can only describe as a massive hand. Its other hand grabbed the top wire of the fence. The wood actually creaked under its grip. I could hear it from where I stood, maybe 40 yards away. Then the wire stretched taut until the staples holding it to the post just popped free, making this pinging sound as they flew out. I was too scared to move, too scared to run back to the house for my phone or a gun or anything. I just stood there watching, trying to convince myself that what I was seeing wasn't real. The creature moved along the fence line, methodically bending posts and pulling wire loose. At one point, it turned slightly toward me, and in that moment, I could see its face in profile. It had a wide, flat nose and what looked like teeth catching in the yard light. Its jaw was thick with visible muscle lines. The expression looked tense, almost angry. I remember thinking that if it decided to come at me, there was absolutely nothing I could do. I've never felt so completely helpless. I'm not a small guy, 6 foot, 190 pounds. But next to this thing, I might as well have been a child. With what seemed like almost no effort, it wrenched an entire fence post out of the ground. These were posts sunk at least 2 feet deep, posts that took me and my neighbor both pushing to get into the ground. It pulled it straight up and tossed it aside like it was nothing, then moved to the next one and did the same thing. For what felt like forever, but was probably about 15 minutes, it systematically damaged the fence line. Every now and then it would let out this sound, not quite a scream, more like a roar, but so deep it seemed to echo across the flat farmland. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not like any animal native to Iowa. The cattle were going nuts, huddled together and making distressed noises. Meanwhile, both dogs had completely abandoned me and retreated under the porch. I don't blame them. I wanted to run too, but I was afraid moving might draw its attention. Finally, after destroying about 50 yards of fence, it just stopped. It stood still for a moment, looking out across our property. I swear it looked directly at me, though I couldn't make out its eyes from that distance. Then it turned and walked toward the tree line that bordered the cornfield, disappearing into the darkness. Its footsteps faded until I couldn't hear them anymore. I waited at least 15 minutes before I moved a muscle, terrified it might come back. When I finally did move, I ran straight to the house, locked every door and window, and grabbed my shotgun. I sat up all night, watching out the window, jumping at every sound. The dogs wouldn't leave the house, no matter how much I tried to get them to go out and pee. I didn't call anyone that night. Who would believe me? What would I even say? Hello, police. There's a giant, hairy monster tearing up my fence. They'd think I was drunk or crazy. When dawn finally came, I went out to examine the damage, still carrying my shotgun. In the daylight, it was even more disturbing. The fence was completely destroyed. Splintered posts lying flat on the ground, twisted wire hanging loose. It would take days and hundreds of dollars to fix. But what really got to me were the footprints. They were pressed deep into the soil along the fence line. Enormous footprints shaped like a bare human foot, but much bigger, with toes spread wide. I put my hand down next to one for scale, and my hand barely covered half of one print. Whatever made those prints had to weigh at least 500 pounds. I took photos of everything with my flip phone, but they came out grainy and unclear. This was 2008, remember? I measured one of the clearer prints using a tape measure. 15.5 inches long. I've got size 12 boots, and these prints made mine look like a child's. I spent that day rebuilding the fence as best I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, I kept all the lights on and barely slept. Over the next few days, I asked around town carefully about whether anyone had seen anything strange. Most people just looked at me like I was crazy. But one old-timer at the feed store got real quiet when I described what happened. He said there'd been stories about something in the area for generations, but most people wrote them off as tall tales. I never saw the creature again, though sometimes at night I'd hear those heavy footsteps at the edge of our property. The dogs would go dead silent and hide under the furniture. The cattle would bunch together in their pasture, but whatever it was stayed in the shadows. I sold the farm the following spring and moved closer to town. I told everyone it was because the commute was too long, but the truth is I couldn't handle the constant fear of that thing returning. I never felt safe there again. To this day, I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright for that long. It wasn't a person in a suit. No costume could fake that kind of strength or movement. What visited our farm that night was what people around here call Bigfoot, though that name seems almost silly compared to the terrifying reality of what I encountered. I think it destroyed our fence to send a message, to remind us that nothing we built could keep it out if it wanted to come onto our property. Maybe it was protecting its territory, or maybe it was just angry about the fence cutting through what it considered its land. Whatever the reason, I still have nightmares about those 15 minutes, about watching something that shouldn't exist methodically destroying a fence that should have taken multiple men and tools to take down, about those massive footprints in the Iowa soil that no known animal could have made. Story 2. I've never really told anyone this story outside my family because, honestly, who'd believe it? But I need to get this off my chest. It happened on Christmas Eve, 2003, and I still think about it all the time. My wife and I were spending the holidays at our friend's cabin in Twain Harte, California, up in the Sierra Mountains. It was supposed to be this perfect Christmas getaway. Snow, pine trees, hot chocolate, the whole deal. The cabin was this rustic place built on stilts, elevated about 6 to 8 feet off the ground, with these wooden stairs leading up to the porch. I remember thinking it was strange how high off the ground it was, but I figured it was probably built that way because of the heavy snowfall they get up there. We'd had a great Christmas Eve, dinner, drinks, board games. My friend had these 2 German shepherds that were super protective, barking at literally everything, squirrels, delivery people, their own shadows sometimes. They finally settled down around 11 and we all headed to bed past midnight. My wife and I were staying in the guest room with these big windows facing the porch. I remember being exhausted but feeling really content, you know, that warm feeling you get on holidays when everything feels right. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly, but I woke up suddenly to what felt like a small tremor. My first thought was earthquake, since we were in California after all. But then I realized it wasn't the ground shaking. It was footsteps. Heavy footsteps on the porch right outside our window. The whole cabin was vibrating slightly with each step. I checked the time. It was 3:22 in the morning, way too late for anyone to be visiting, especially on Christmas Eve in a somewhat remote cabin. I figured maybe my friend had gotten up to let the dogs out or something, but then I realized I hadn't heard the dogs bark, which was weird because those dogs went absolutely nuts whenever anyone approached the property. I needed to use the bathroom anyway, so I carefully got out of bed, trying not to wake my wife. The bathroom was across the hall, and I remember walking as quietly as possible, still hearing those heavy footsteps outside. I kept thinking, why aren't the dogs barking? They should be going crazy right now. After using the bathroom, I crept back to our room. The footsteps were still there, but slower now, like whatever was out there was taking its time. I looked toward our window, and that's when I saw it. At first, in the dim light from the porch lamp, I thought it was a man with long hair. I froze completely. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was thinking we were about to be robbed or something worse, but as my eyes adjusted better to the darkness, I realized the hair wasn't just on its head. It was everywhere, covering its arms, its back, all of it. This orange-brownish color that looked almost reddish in the yellow porch light. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The thing was massive. Had to be around 6'6", maybe taller. It looked heavy too, probably around 300 pounds, but not fat, strong. Not like a bodybuilder with defined muscles, but just powerful, solid. like those strongman competitors who can lift cars but don't have six-pack abs. It was standing with its side toward me, and I got a good look at its profile. Its face wasn't exactly like an ape, not like the gorillas you see at the zoo. It was more like, you know those drawings in history books of early humans or cavemen? Kind of like that. It had this big nose and a heavy brow, and even from the side I could see these dark brown eyes that looked almost human. That was the scariest part. Not how big it was, but how its eyes seemed to have this intelligence behind them. The creature was moving slowly around the porch, occasionally touching the railing or the wall of the cabin. Its movements were deliberate, careful, like it was trying not to make noise, but each step still made the porch creak under its weight. I remember its breath making these little clouds in the cold air. Every few minutes it would turn its head slightly toward the window where I was standing, and I ducked down, terrified it would see me. But I don't think it was really looking for anyone. It seemed more like it was just curious, exploring. The strangest thing was its expression. It looked almost sad, not angry or threatening, just melancholy, like it was lost or something. I know that sounds crazy, projecting human emotions onto whatever this thing was, but that's honestly what it looked like to me. I stood there watching it for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes. The whole time, I kept waiting for the dogs to start barking. These were dogs that would wake the entire household if a leaf blew across the yard, but they made absolutely no sound while this massive creature was walking around on the porch. At one point I glanced over at my wife, who was still sound asleep. I thought about waking her up, but what would I say? Hey, there's a Bigfoot on the porch. I didn't even believe what I was seeing myself. Part of me thought I must be dreaming, or that the whiskey we'd had earlier was playing tricks on me. But I wasn't dreaming. It was right there, less than 20 feet away from me, separated only by a window and a wall. Then the creature did something that still gives me chills when I think about it. It walked to the edge of the porch, right near the stairs, and then, instead of going down the stairs like a person would, it just jumped, straight down from about 8 feet up, landing in the snow below with a muffled thud. It didn't make a sound when it landed. No grunt, no cry of pain, nothing. It just absorbed the impact like it was nothing and started walking away from the cabin. I rushed to the window to see where it was going. It walked with this strange gait, not quite like a human, but not like an ape either. Kind of a rolling motion, powerful but smooth. It headed straight for the tree line about 50 yards from the cabin and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there for a good 10 minutes, staring into the darkness, half expecting it to come back. But it didn't. Eventually, I got back into bed, but I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there, trying to process what I'd seen, wondering if I was losing my mind. When morning came, I went outside to look for footprints. There were some indentations in the snow where it had jumped down from the porch, but they weren't clear footprints, just disturbed snow. It had snowed lightly overnight, which probably covered most of the tracks. I never told my friend about what I saw. I mentioned to my wife the next morning that I thought I'd seen someone on the porch during the night, but I didn't go into details. She just said I was probably dreaming and changed the subject to Christmas breakfast. I didn't push it because, honestly, I wasn't sure myself if what I'd seen was real. But the thing that convinced me I wasn't just seeing things was the dogs. Those 2 German shepherds that barked at everything didn't make a sound that night, not a single bark. The next morning, they seemed subdued, staying close to my friend instead of running around the property like they usually did. When we took them for a walk later that day, they refused to go near the area where the creature had walked into the forest. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just a really tall, hairy person. Maybe it was some kind of bear, though I've never seen a bear move like that or stand so upright for so long. Maybe I was half asleep and imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I know what I saw. It was a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. It was there on that porch on Christmas Eve, and it looked right at me. The weirdest part is that I wasn't afraid the whole time. Shocked, yes. In disbelief, absolutely, but not terrified like you'd expect. There was something about its demeanor, its sad eyes, that made me feel like it wasn't there to hurt anyone. It was just there, existing. Maybe as surprised to see a cabin full of humans as I was to see it. I've read accounts from other people who claim to have seen similar creatures, and many of them describe the same feeling. This sense that the creature isn't malevolent, just different, another being sharing the same world but staying hidden most of the time. I still go camping and hiking, I still love the outdoors, but I'm always a little more alert now, always scanning the tree line, always listening a little more carefully to the sounds of the forest. Not out of fear, but because I know there's something else out there, something that most people go their whole lives without seeing. I've never seen it again, despite going back to those mountains many times. Sometimes I think that Christmas Eve was a gift in a strange way, a rare glimpse at something few people ever get to see. Other times I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those intelligent eyes looking at me, and I know it was real. The dogs knew it too. They knew something was out there that night, something not quite animal, not quite human, and they had the good sense to stay quiet. Story 3. I've been sitting on this experience for years, going back and forth about whether I should share it. I'm a rational person. I have a biology degree, for crying out loud, and I've always approached the world with skepticism. But what happened that night in October 2015 has completely changed how I view things. I still can't explain it, and it honestly still freaks me out to think about. My wife and I were camping at Yawari National Forest that weekend. We had our 2 dogs with us, and we'd set up at this nice site right at the edge of the campground. Behind our site was nothing but dense woods. It was a gorgeous fall weekend. Crisp air, leaves changing colors, that whole thing. Perfect camping weather. I'd just bought a new hammock and was excited to try it out. After dinner on Saturday, I set it up about 20 or 30 feet into the trees behind our campsite. Nothing crazy, just far enough to feel like I was actually sleeping in the forest, you know? I could still see our tent from where I was hanging. My wife decided to sleep in the tent with the dogs, which in hindsight was probably the smarter choice. Everything was fine when I first went to sleep. The temperature had dropped, but I was snug in my sleeping bag inside the hammock. I remember falling asleep to the sound of the occasional car driving past the campground and the distant murmur of people talking at other campsites. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, the sound of branches snapping about 30 to 50 feet away in the woods. Now I've spent enough time outdoors to know what it sounds like when animals move through the forest. This was different. Whatever was causing the sounds wasn't moving around. The breaking sounds were staying in roughly the same spot. I lay completely still in my hammock, barely breathing, just listening. That's when I heard this sound that made my skin crawl, a deep, drawn-out vocalization. The closest thing I can compare it to is a deer's alarm call, but much, much deeper, like unnaturally deep. It wasn't a bear or a moose or anything I could identify, and I've heard pretty much all the common wildlife sounds in these parts. For about 15 minutes, the branch breaking continued intermittently. Just when I thought it might stop, it would start up again. Then the pattern changed, and this is where it got really weird. The sounds developed this alternating rhythm. A branch would snap, followed immediately by what sounded exactly like a single bird wing beat. Snap, flutter, over and over. I was frozen in place. My heart was pounding so hard, I was worried whatever was out there might hear it. I kept telling myself it was probably just some animal, maybe a bear, but deep down I knew this wasn't normal animal behavior. Whatever was making those sounds seemed deliberate, almost methodical. I had no idea what to do. My wife and dogs were in the tent. only 30 feet away, but it felt like miles. I was terrified to move, afraid that whatever was out there would notice me. The hammock suddenly felt like the most exposed, vulnerable place in the world. Then I heard my wife cough in the tent. That small, normal sound broke the spell of fear that had me paralyzed. I took the opportunity to quickly but quietly slip out of my hammock. My legs were shaking so badly I almost fell when my feet hit the ground. I grabbed my headlamp from where I'd hung it on a nearby branch and stood there listening. The branch breaking continued. Whatever it was, it hadn't moved or reacted to me getting out of the hammock. I knew one thing for sure. I did not want to get back in that hammock, but I also didn't want to just bolt for the tent like a scared kid. Some stubborn part of me wanted to assert myself, to show whatever was out there that this was my campsite. So I started making noise. I picked up some branches from the ground and deliberately broke them, then tossed them into the woods in the direction of the sounds. I even, and this is embarrassing but true, urinated around my hammock area, like I was marking my territory. I know, primitive, but fear does weird things to your brain. Something interesting happened when I started making noise. The branch breaking stopped. As soon as I was loud, whatever it was went silent. When I stopped making noise, after about 30 seconds, the breaking would start again. Then I discovered something that made my blood run cold. When I turned on my headlamp and pointed it toward the sounds, they stopped immediately. When I turned it off after about 20 seconds, they would start again. I tested this pattern several times, and it was consistent every single time. On, silence. Off, snap, flutter, snap, flutter. Whatever was out there was watching me, responding to me. It was aware of the light, aware of my movements and sounds. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was interaction. That realization was the final straw. My heart was racing, and I felt this primal fear wash over me like nothing I've ever experienced. I grabbed my sleeping bag from the hammock and made a beeline for the tent. I tried to move quietly, but at that point, I was more concerned with speed than stealth. I slipped into the tent and zipped it up behind me, waking my wife in the process. "What's wrong?" she whispered, immediately picking up on my panic. "Something's out there," I whispered back, "in the woods, making weird sounds." I didn't elaborate further. I didn't want to scare her, and honestly, I didn't know how to explain what I'd just experienced. Our dogs were both awake now too, alert but surprisingly quiet. They were listening, ears perked up, staring at the tent wall facing the woods. From inside the tent we could still hear the snapping, snap, flutter, snap, flutter. It continued for about 15 more minutes, neither getting closer nor moving away. Then there was one final sound, one huge break that echoed through the woods. It sounded like a 4-inch log being snapped clean in half. The sound reverberated in a way that felt like a final warning. I'm strong and I'm leaving now. After that, silence, complete, absolute silence. No normal forest sounds, no distant campers, nothing. Just eerie, unnatural quiet. None of us slept the rest of the night. We sat there in the tent, me clutching my headlamp like a weapon, my wife holding onto the dogs, waiting for dawn. The silence was almost worse than the sounds had been. When morning finally came, I was almost convinced I'd imagined the whole thing or blown some normal forest sounds out of proportion. But my wife had heard that final snap too, and the dogs had definitely sensed something. After breakfast, we decided to check out the area where the sounds had come from. I was nervous about going into those woods, but daylight made me braver. We walked about 50 feet in, looking for broken branches, tracks, anything that would explain what I'd heard. We found nothing conclusive. Some broken branches, sure, but nothing that couldn't have been caused by wind or normal wildlife. No footprints that we could discern in the leaf litter, no fur or scat or any other obvious signs. But something felt off about that section of forest. It was subtle, a feeling of being watched, of something not quite right. My wife felt it too. She kept looking over her shoulder, and she's usually the practical one between us. We packed up and left a few hours later, cutting our trip short by a day. Neither of us wanted to spend another night there. On the drive home, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear with odd behavior. Maybe it was some kind of bird I'd never encountered before. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks in the trees. But none of those explanations sat right with me. They didn't account for the patterns I'd observed, the response to light and noise, the deliberate nature of the sounds, that final massive snap that felt like a message. Before that night, I would have laughed if someone told me they believed in Bigfoot or other unexplained forest creatures. Now, I'm not so quick to dismiss those stories. I don't know what was in those woods with me, but it was intelligent. It was aware of me, and it wanted me to know it was there. It's been 8 years, and I still think about that night regularly. I've gone camping many times since then, but I've never slept in a hammock in the woods again. And whenever I'm in the forest at night and hear branches breaking in the distance, a part of me freezes, waiting to hear that pattern again, snap, flutter, and hoping I never do. Story 4. I've been trying to make sense of what happened for months now, but I still can't explain it. Typing this makes my hands shake, but I need to get it out. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar and can help me understand. This happened last September when I went hunting with 4 buddies: Carl, his brother Mike, Jeff, and Rick. We've all been friends since college, all experienced hunters who knew what we were doing in the woods. Carl suggested this spot in the national forest where he and Mike grew up, about 3 hours from town. According to them, the area was packed with deer, and since we all had some vacation days to burn, we planned a 4-day trip. We arrived on Thursday afternoon, setting up camp in this perfect little clearing next to a creek. It was remote. We'd driven about 7 miles down an old logging road, then hiked another 2 miles to reach the spot. The isolation was exactly what we wanted. No cell service, no other people, just us and the woods. The first 2 days were perfect. Weather was great, cool in the mornings, warm during the day. We split up into pairs during hunting hours, but hadn't taken any shots yet. We were seeing plenty of deer sign though, fresh tracks, droppings, some rubs on trees, but honestly, none of us was in a hurry to bag anything. This trip was more about getting away from our jobs, wives, and responsibilities for a few days. Saturday night is when everything went to hell. We'd had a good dinner. Rick had brought steaks and we'd cooked them over the fire with some potatoes and corn. We were sitting around the campfire, drinking beers, shooting the shit like we always did. It was probably around 9 o'clock, the forest completely dark except for our fire. Mike was in the middle of some story about his boss when we heard it. The sound came from somewhere deep in the forest to the north of us. It was this long, drawn-out call, I guess you'd call it, deep and resonant, almost like a moan but more controlled. It started low, rose slightly in the middle, then trailed off at the end. Lasted maybe 6 or 7 seconds. It was loud enough that it cut right through our conversation, and we all just stopped talking instantly. Carl was the first to speak after it ended. What the hell was that? Coyote? But he didn't sound convinced, and none of us bought it either. I've heard plenty of coyotes. They yip and howl, make these high-pitched sounds. This was nothing like that. This was deep, almost guttural, and it carried through the trees in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. Before anyone could respond, another call answered from the opposite direction, from the south. This one sounded closer, maybe half a mile away. Same type of sound, same pattern, but definitely coming from a different source. Elk? Jeff suggested, but his voice was tight. Rick shook his head. I've hunted elk in Colorado for 10 years. That's not an elk. We all fell silent again, listening. The forest around us seemed to be holding its breath. Then the first call came again, from the north, but it sounded closer now. The southern call responded almost immediately after, definitely closer than before. Someone fucking with us, Carl suggested, but there was an edge to his voice I'd never heard before. Mike shook his head. We're at least 9 miles from the nearest road. Who would hike all the way out here just to make weird noises at us? Besides, these didn't sound like human noises. I mean, I don't think a person could make sounds that deep or that loud without some kind of equipment. And the way they carried through the trees, it was unnatural. I know how sound travels in forests, and these calls were reaching us much clearer than they should have. The calls continued, back and forth. We counted at least 4 exchanges, and with each one, both sources seemed to be getting closer. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. These things were communicating with each other. That realization hit us all at about the same time. We stopped talking and just listened, our beers forgotten in our hands. The fire popped and crackled, throwing our shadows against the trees behind us, and I suddenly had this overwhelming feeling that we were being watched from just beyond the firelight. Then we heard something else, a cracking sound like a branch breaking from the direction of the southern caller. It wasn't far away at all now, maybe a couple 100 yards at most. Jeff stood up abruptly. "I don't like this," he said. "I'm packing up." None of us gave him shit about it, which says a lot. Normally, we'd never let one of our group live down getting spooked in the woods, but this time, we all felt it. Something was very wrong. The northern caller let out another sound, but this one was different, shorter, more urgent. Almost immediately, there was a response from the east, a direction we hadn't heard from before. That's when I realized we were being surrounded. "There's more than 2, Mike said quietly. We all started packing up then, no discussion needed. We didn't bother with most of our gear, just grabbed our rifles, packs, and enough essentials to get us out of there. We could come back for the rest later, in daylight if we felt brave enough. The fire was still going strong as we prepared to leave, and I was grateful for the light it provided. The night seemed darker than it should have been, the trees around our clearing creating a wall of absolute blackness. As we were getting ready to head out, another call sounded. This one so close, I could almost feel the vibration of it in my chest. It came from just beyond the tree line to our west, no more than 100 yards away. The others responded from their positions, creating this terrible chorus around us. "Stay together," Carl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Keep your lights on and your rifles ready." We formed a tight group and headed for the trail that would take us back to the logging road where we'd left our trucks. Rick took point with his flashlight, Jeff and I were in the middle, and Carl and Mike brought up the rear. Every few seconds, one of us would sweep our light through the trees around us, but we never saw anything. The calls continued as we moved, seeming to track our progress. They would sound from one direction, then another would answer from somewhere else, always maintaining their distance, but never falling behind as we walked. The hike back to the trucks should have taken about 40 minutes, but we made it in 25, moving as fast as we safely could through the dark forest. No one spoke. We were all straining our ears, listening for footsteps or movement in the underbrush, but there was nothing except those calls echoing around us. When we finally reached the clearing where we'd parked, I nearly collapsed with relief. The trucks were still there, untouched. We threw our gear into the beds and piled into the cabs, Carl, Mike and I in one truck, Jeff and Rick in the other. As Mike was starting the engine, one final call sounded from directly behind us, at the edge of the clearing. It was so loud and so close that it seemed to rattle the windows. I turned to look out the back window, but couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond our taillights. We drove in silence for the first few miles, the trucks bouncing over the rough logging road. Only when we hit pavement did anyone speak. "What the fuck was that?" Jeff said over the walkie-talkie we used to communicate between vehicles. No one had an answer. We speculated during the 3-hour drive home. Animals, other hunters playing a prank, maybe even some kind of territorial locals. But none of those explanations fit what we'd experienced. Carl and Mike, who grew up in that area, swore they'd never heard anything like those sounds before. Rick, our most experienced outdoorsman, couldn't identify them either. The way they surrounded us, the way they seemed to communicate and coordinate, it wasn't natural. We ended up going back a week later in daylight with a larger group to retrieve our abandoned gear. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, untouched. We didn't hear the calls again, but none of us wanted to linger. We packed up and were out of there within an hour. I've tried researching similar experiences since then. The closest thing I've found are accounts of Sasquatch vocalizations, but I'm not ready to go there yet. I've always been skeptical of that stuff. But I know what I heard, and I know it wasn't any animal I'm familiar with. Whatever was out there that night, it was intelligent. It was coordinating with others of its kind, and it was letting us know that we weren't welcome. I haven't been hunting since. None of us has. When we get together now, we don't talk about that night, but I can see it in their eyes. They're still trying to make sense of it too. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear one of those calls again, that deep, resonant sound that seems to bypass your ears and vibrate directly in your chest. I know it's just my mind playing tricks, but I still lie awake afterward, listening. I don't know if I'll ever go back to those woods. Part of me wants answers, wants to know what was out there surrounding us. But a bigger part knows that some questions are better left unanswered. Some things you're not meant to understand. All I know is that something was out there in those trees that night. Something that could think, something that could plan, something that wanted us gone. And whatever it was, we were lucky it only wanted to scare us away. Story 5. I still can't believe what I saw that morning. It's been 3 weeks and I haven't slept properly since. I keep replaying it in my mind, questioning if it really happened, but I know what I saw. It was a Thursday in August. One of those perfect summer mornings where the air feels fresh and the sunlight filters through the trees in these beautiful golden rays. My husband Tom and I had been at our cabin for about a week. We'd saved for years to buy this place, our little retreat in the mountains, surrounded by forest on 3 sides. The isolation was exactly what we wanted. At least, that's what we thought. I'm usually an early riser, but that morning I'd slept in. Tom was downstairs making coffee. I could smell it from the bedroom. Our bedroom is on the 2nd floor with this big window that overlooks the densest part of the forest behind our property. There's a small clearing about 40 or 50 meters from the cabin, and then it's just trees as far as you can see. I was still in that half-asleep state, you know, just lying there, enjoying the quiet. I reached over and pulled up the blind without even thinking about it. It's something I do every morning. Let the sunlight in, check the weather, see if any deer are around. But what I saw wasn't a deer. Right as I lifted the blind, this large, dark figure emerged from the tree line into that little clearing. My brain tried to process what I was seeing. My first thought was, there's someone walking through our woods, which was already unsettling because we're pretty isolated out here. The nearest neighbor is over 2 miles away. I remember thinking I should call Tom upstairs to see. I opened my mouth to yell for him, but something stopped me. It was this feeling, I can't really explain it properly. Like every cell in my body suddenly went on high alert. A wave of fear washed over me, not the kind of fear you get watching a horror movie or hearing a weird noise at night. This was deeper, primal, like something hardwired into my DNA was screaming, danger. That's when I really looked at it. This wasn't a person, not even close. It was tall, well over 6 feet, maybe 7 feet. Hard to judge from my vantage point, but definitely taller than any person I know. And the shoulders, God, the shoulders were massive. So broad and powerful looking, the whole body was covered in this medium brown hair or fur. Not uniform either. There were different shades throughout, darker in some areas, lighter in others. What really caught my eye was this pale patch on its side, almost yellowish, like hay color. The morning sun hit it just right, making it stand out against the darker fur. The way it moved, that's what really gets me. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you might expect something that big to move. It was fluid, graceful even, powerful. It crossed that entire clearing in just 3 strides. 3, a space that would take me maybe 15 or 20 steps to cross, and it was silent. Completely silent. No branches breaking, no heavy footfalls. Nothing. Just this massive thing moving through our clearing like a ghost. I was frozen, completely unable to move or call out. Just watching through the window, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then it happened. As it reached the far side of the clearing, it stopped. Just for a second, and it turned. It turned and looked directly at our window, directly at me. Our eyes met. I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It was dark, almost grayish and completely flat. Nothing like a gorilla or any ape I've seen pictures of, and completely hairless, no fur on the face at all. It was such a stark contrast to the rest of its body. The eyes, I couldn't make out the color from that distance, but they were intelligent, aware, knowing. It felt like we stared at each other for minutes, but it must have been just a split second. Time got weird. It was like everything slowed down for that one moment, and then it was gone. It turned and disappeared into the trees on the other side of the clearing. No crashing through underbrush. No sound at all. Just gone. I don't know how long I sat there staring out the window at the now empty clearing. My whole body was shaking. I couldn't catch my breath. I felt cold and hot at the same time. "You okay up there?" Tom called from downstairs. His voice snapped me back to reality. I tried to answer, but couldn't find my voice. I heard him coming up the stairs. "Hey, coffee's ready," he said, poking his head into the bedroom. Then he saw my face. "Jesus, what's wrong?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." I grabbed his arm and pulled him to the window. "There was something out there," I whispered. I didn't want to say it too loud, as if the thing might hear me. "Something big." Tom looked out the window, scanning the tree line. "A bear?" he asked. I shook my head. "Number, not a bear. It walked on 2 legs, like a person, but not a person." He gave me that look, that "are you still half asleep and dreaming" look. But he could tell I was genuinely shaken. "Stay here," he said. "I'm going to go check it out." "No!" I grabbed his arm harder. "Don't go out there, please." He tried to reassure me, said he'd just walk to the edge of our property line, that he'd take the rifle just in case. I begged him not to go, but he insisted, said we needed to know if someone was trespassing. He didn't believe me. Not really. How could he? If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. I watched from the window as Tom walked across our yard toward the clearing. He had the rifle slung over his shoulder, trying to look casual, but I could tell he was on alert. He disappeared into the trees at the edge of our property. Those 10 minutes he was gone were the longest of my life. I kept scanning the tree line, terrified I'd see that thing again, terrified it would find Tom. My mind was racing through all the possibilities. What if it attacked him? What if he couldn't find his way back? What if? When he finally emerged from the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. He walked back to the cabin slowly, looking thoughtful. I met him at the door. "Nothing," he said. "No tracks, no broken branches. Nothing." "But I saw it," I insisted. "I swear to you, Tom. It was right there in the clearing." He put his hands on my shoulders. "I believe you saw something," he said carefully. "But there's nothing out there now. We spent the rest of the morning in this weird tension. Tom tried to go about his day normally, but he kept looking out windows, checking the tree line. I couldn't settle, couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Around noon, I was sitting on the porch, still watching the woods, when I heard it, this sound that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It wasn't quite a howl, not quite a scream, something in between, and unlike anything I've ever heard before. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tom was inside, but he heard it too. He came running out onto the porch. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his face pale. "That's what I saw," I whispered. "I'm sure of it." We didn't talk much about what to do next. We just started packing. Neither of us said we were leaving for good, just that maybe we should head back to the city for a few days. Think things through. As we were loading the car, our nearest neighbor, Bill, drove up in his truck. He lives about 2 miles down the road and occasionally stops by to check in on us city folks, as he calls us. "Heading out early?" he asked, climbing out of his truck. Tom explained we had some unexpected business to take care of in town. I could tell he didn't want to mention what I'd seen. Bill nodded, then looked toward our woods with this strange expression. "You folks hear anything unusual this morning?" he asked casually. Too casually. Tom and I exchanged glances. "Like what?" Tom asked. Bill shrugged. "Oh, nothing, probably. Just thought I heard something while I was out checking my property line. Probably just a coyote or something. I couldn't help myself." "It wasn't a coyote," I said. Tom gave me a look, but I ignored him. "I saw something in the clearing behind our cabin this morning. Something big, walking on 2 legs. I expected Bill to laugh, to give me that same patronizing look Tom had given me earlier. But he didn't. He got very quiet, looking at me with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "You saw it?" he asked quietly. Tom stepped forward. "Saw what exactly, Bill?" Bill looked around, as if making sure no one else could hear, which was ridiculous given how isolated we were. "Folks around here don't talk about it much," he said. "Bad luck to talk about it. But sometimes people see things in these woods. Things that don't make sense." "What kind of things?" I pressed. He shook his head. "Just things. My grandfather used to say these mountains had guardians, old spirits that walked the forests before people came. Said if you respected them and their land, they'd leave you be." "And if you didn't?" Tom asked. Bill just looked at him. "Then they wouldn't." We finished loading the car in silence after Bill left. Tom tried to downplay what Bill had said he was probably just messing with us, but I could tell he was unsettled too. As we drove away, I kept looking back at our cabin, at the tree line beyond it. Part of me expected to see that figure again, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just trees swaying gently in the August breeze. We've been back in the city for 3 weeks now. Tom wants to go back to the cabin this weekend. Says we can't let some animal sighting scare us away from a place we love. He's convinced himself it was a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe even a person in some kind of costume, though he can't explain why anyone would be doing that on our property. But I know what I saw, and I know it saw me too. That's the part I can't shake. The knowledge in those eyes, the recognition, like it knew exactly who and what I was. I don't think we should go back, or if we do, something needs to change. Like Bill said, respect. Maybe we've been treating the forest like it's just scenery, not someone else's home. I don't know. All I know is that when I close my eyes at night, I see that face. Those eyes, and I hear that sound echoing through the trees, and I wonder if it's still there, watching our empty cabin, waiting to see if we'll come back. Story 6. I never thought I'd be one of those people posting about seeing a Bigfoot. Hell, I used to laugh at those stories. But what happened to me in the Allegheny National Forest back in 2011 has been eating at me for years. I need to get this off my chest. It was October 3rd, a Monday. I remember because I had taken the day off work specifically to scout for deer season. The weather was perfect that morning. Crisp fall air, temperature in the low 50s, and this light mist hanging over the forest floor that usually burns off by mid-morning. I'd been hunting these woods since I was a teenager, knew them like the back of my hand. At least I thought I did. I parked my truck at one of the Forest Service roads around 7 in the morning, had my day pack with some water, trail mix, my usual gear, brought my .30-06 rifle too, not to hunt, just for protection, and to get a feel for carrying it on the terrain I'd be hunting later in the season. Also had my good Nikon binoculars hanging around my neck. Nothing unusual about any of this. Just another day in the woods. My plan was to hike to this ridge I knew about, roughly a mile in. There had been a controlled burn there a couple years back, and those areas are gold for deer scouting. New growth attracts them like crazy. I'd seen plenty of buck sign there in previous seasons. The hike-in was uneventful. Just me, crunching through fallen leaves, occasionally stopping to look at scrapes or rubs. The forest was doing its usual thing, chickadees calling, squirrels rustling in the canopy. I remember feeling completely at ease. This was my element. I reached the ridge around 8:30. It's not very high, maybe 100 feet above a clearing that spans about 5 acres. The burn area was greening up nicely with waist-high saplings and shrubs, perfect browsing for deer. I found a good spot against a big oak tree where I had a clear view of the whole clearing, settled in and started glassing the area with my binoculars. For about 45 minutes, nothing much happened. Saw a couple of does with fawns at the far edge, made some notes in my little scouting journal about their movement patterns. The sun had burned off most of the morning mist by then, and I was just thinking about moving to another location when I heard it. The sound was unmistakable, wood breaking. Not the light crack of a deer stepping on a dry branch, but heavy, deliberate breaking, like someone snapping a baseball bat in half. Then another crack, and another, coming from the far side of the clearing, maybe 200 yards away. My first thought was black bear. They'll tear apart rotting logs looking for grubs and insects. Made sense. I lifted my binoculars and scanned the tree line where the sound was coming from. What I saw through those lenses froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't a bear. It was standing upright at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the last of the morning mist, but clear enough that I could make out its shape. Tall, impossibly tall. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. I actually lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, and looked again with the naked eye. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive. I raised the binoculars again, hands suddenly unsteady. The creature, and I hesitate to even call it that because it sounds so clinical and detached from the primal fear I felt, was tearing apart a fallen log with its hands. Bare hands, ripping chunks of rotted wood like it was tearing cardboard. I could see it clearly now through the binoculars, 8 feet tall at least, maybe taller. Not lanky or thin like they sometimes describe in stories, but solid, wide, powerful. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, not shaggy like a bear, but more uniform, maybe 3 to 4 inches long. I could see its face. God, I could see its face. A sloped forehead that protruded over deep-set eyes, wide cheekbones, a large jaw. Its nose was broad and flat. Not human, but not fully animal either. Something in between that made my skin crawl. Its chest was barrel-shaped, tapering to a more narrow waist, with long, muscular arms that hung lower than a human's would. As I watched, it continued tearing the log apart, occasionally pausing to pick something out of the wood, grubs or insects, I guess, and put them in its mouth. The casual way it demolished that log told me everything I needed to know about its strength. It wasn't struggling. It wasn't working hard. It was just doing it like I would tear a piece of bread. I don't know how long I watched. Time seemed to stop. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it even from that distance. I wasn't breathing, wasn't blinking, wasn't thinking, just watching. Then something changed. The creature stopped suddenly, went completely still, and then, slowly, it turned its head toward my ridge, toward me. I swear to God, it looked right at me, right through the binoculars, like it could feel me watching. There's no way it could have heard me or seen me from that distance. I was downwind. I was being quiet, but somehow it knew. It made a sound then, started as a low growl deep in its chest, like the rumble of distant thunder. The growl built into something else, something I've never heard before or since. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, something primal that reached into my chest and squeezed. Without any visible effort, it picked up a massive chunk of the log it had been tearing apart, must have been 4 feet long and thick as my thigh, and hurled it. Not randomly, directly toward my ridge. The piece flew through the air with incredible force. and smashed against a stump about 50 yards below my position, exploding into splinters. It was a warning. Had to be. No other explanation. It was telling me to back off. I dropped flat to the ground, pressing myself into the forest floor, not daring to look up. My rifle was right next to me, but the thought of using it seemed absurd. What was I going to do against something that could throw a log like that? I lay there, barely breathing, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but my own pulse hammering in my ears. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, I risked lifting my head just enough to peer over the ridge. It was still there, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring directly at my position. Not moving, just watching. I lowered my head again, fighting the urge to run, knowing that movement would be the worst thing I could do. Eventually, I heard something. Heavy footsteps, moving away. Slow, deliberate steps. After a few moments, I lifted my head again to look. The creature was walking toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing, walking upright with a stride that covered ground quickly, despite not appearing hurried. Its arms swung at its sides, its head swiveling occasionally, as if scanning its surroundings. As it reached the edge of the forest, it pushed aside a small tree. Not breaking it, just moving it out of the way like I would push aside a curtain, and disappeared into the woods. I stayed frozen for at least 10 minutes, maybe longer, didn't move a muscle. When I finally convinced myself it was gone, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I grabbed my rifle, not even bothering with the binoculars that had fallen from my hands, and got the hell out of there. Didn't walk, ran, stumbling, falling, getting up again, running like I've never run before. I reached my truck in half the time it had taken me to hike in, fumbled with the keys, dropped them, picked them up with trembling hands, and finally got the door open. I sat there for a long time, engine running, heater on full blast, despite not being cold, trying to process what I'd seen. I thought about going back the next day to look for evidence, tracks, hair, the broken log. Something to prove to myself I hadn't imagined it all, but I couldn't do it. The thought of returning to that ridge made me physically ill. Even now, more than a decade later, I get sweaty palms thinking about it. I've been back to Allegheny since then, had to. Hunting is part of who I am, but I'm different there now. I stay closer to roads, closer to other hunters. My rifle isn't just for deer anymore, though God knows what good it would do against something like that. I'm more aware of sounds, of feeling watched. The forest doesn't feel like home anymore. I've tried telling a few close friends over the years. Most laugh it off, think I'm pulling their leg. One suggested a bear standing on its hind legs. Another thought maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed it. I've stopped talking about it. But I know what I saw that day. I know it wasn't a bear or a dream or a man in a suit. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the casual display of strength, no human could fake that. No known animal matches what I saw. I still go into the woods, still hunt, still hike. But I carry with me the knowledge that we don't know everything that's out there, that the forests hold secrets we've barely begun to understand. And sometimes, when I'm sitting alone in my tree stand at dawn, watching the forest wake up around me, I catch myself scanning the tree line, wondering if somewhere out there it's watching me too. Story 7. I still can't get that day out of my head, even though it's been decades. September 23rd, 1973. I was 15 at the time, living with my parents in rural Pennsylvania, about 40 miles outside of Pittsburgh. Our house was pretty isolated, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with just a single dirt road leading out to the main highway. That Sunday, my friend Bobby and I had spent the afternoon fishing at Miller's Creek, about 2 miles from my house. We weren't supposed to go that far, but the fishing was always better there. We'd lost track of time, and by late afternoon, we realized we needed to head back before dark. Bobby's older brother was supposed to pick us up at the edge of Baxter Road around 6 o'clock. The sun was starting to set as we waited at the pickup spot. It was that weird time of day when the shadows get long and everything gets quiet. I remember the temperature dropped suddenly, like someone had opened a freezer door. September in Pennsylvania can be unpredictable, but this felt different. It felt wrong. "Feel that?" I asked Bobby. He nodded, rubbing his arms. We were standing near the tree line where the forest met the road. The spot was marked by an old wooden fence post that had been there forever. Bobby was sitting on it while I was pacing back and forth, annoyed that his brother was late again. That's when we heard it, a sound like branches breaking but rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but heavier than any person could make. I remember looking at Bobby and seeing his face change. His eyes went wide and he slid off the fence post. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I turned toward the woods, and at first I couldn't see anything. The trees were dark, but there was still enough light to make out shapes. Then I saw movement about 50 yards in, something shifting between the trees, something big. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. I think we were both trying to convince ourselves it was just a deer, or maybe a bear, though bears weren't common in our area. But then it moved into a small clearing, and I felt my entire body go cold. The thing was tall, impossibly tall. I'd say at least 8 feet. It was standing upright on 2 legs, but it wasn't human. Not even close. Its body was covered in thick white fur that seemed to glow slightly in the dim light. But what really got me, what I still see in my nightmares, were its eyes. They were bright red, like hot coals, and they reflected the dying sunlight in a way that made them look like they were glowing from within. I grabbed Bobby's arm so hard he winced, but he didn't pull away. We were both frozen, watching this thing. It hadn't seen us yet. At least, I don't think it had. It was looking down at something it was holding in one of its hands. That's when I noticed the sphere. The creature was cradling what looked like a perfectly round ball in its massive hand. The sphere was glowing with a bluish-white light, illuminating the creature's face from below. I could now see its features more clearly. A flat nose, a wide mouth with what looked like sharp teeth, and those terrible red eyes. Bobby made a small noise, something between a gasp and a whimper, and the creature's head snapped up. It looked directly at us, and I swear to God, time stopped. Those red eyes locked onto mine, and I felt something pass between us. Not communication exactly, but an awareness. It knew me somehow, not just that I was there, but who I was, what I was thinking, what I was afraid of. I don't remember deciding to run. 1 second we were standing there, paralyzed, and the next we were sprinting down the road toward my house. I could hear Bobby's ragged breathing next to me, but I didn't dare look back. I was convinced that if I turned around, that thing would be right behind us, reaching for us with its long arms. We ran the whole way to my house without stopping. By the time we burst through the front door, we were both gasping for air. My mom was in the kitchen making dinner, and my dad was sitting at the table reading the newspaper. They both looked up, startled by our dramatic entrance. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you two?" my dad asked, putting down his paper. We tried to tell them what we'd seen, talking over each other, our words tumbling out in a panicked rush. I remember my mum looking concerned, thinking we were playing some kind of prank. But my dad's reaction was different. His face got serious, and he kept asking questions about exactly where we'd seen it and what the creature was doing. When we mentioned the glowing sphere, something changed in his expression. He got up from the table, went to the closet, and pulled out his hunting rifle. "Dad, what are you doing?" I asked. "Going to check it out," he said, loading the gun. My mum protested, saying it was getting dark and probably just some kind of animal we'd mistaken in the poor light. But my dad was adamant. He told us to stay in the house, lock the doors, and not to go outside for any reason until he got back. I remember watching from the living room window as my dad walked down our driveway and disappeared into the darkness. My mom tried to distract us by making hot chocolate and saying Bobby should call his brother to let him know where he was. But neither of us could settle down. Every sound from outside made us jump. An hour passed. Then another half hour. My mom was pacing now too, checking the window every few minutes. Bobby had called his house, and his parents said his brother had gone looking for them, but came back saying they weren't at the pickup spot. Finally, we heard the sound of the front door opening. My dad walked in, and I knew immediately something was wrong. He was pale, his hands slightly shaking as he carefully placed his rifle back in the closet. He hadn't fired it. I could tell because it still had the same number of shells. "Did you see it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and drank half of it in one gulp. My dad wasn't a big drinker, so this was unusual behavior. "Bobby," he said finally, "your parents are worried. I'm going to drive you home now." "But what did you see?" Bobby persisted. My dad looked at him, then at me, then at my mom. "Nothing," he said. "I didn't see anything." I knew he was lying. I could see it in the tight set of his jaw, the way he wouldn't meet our eyes directly. Something had happened out there, something that had shaken him badly. Before they left to take Bobby home, my dad pulled me aside. "I don't want you going into those woods anymore," he said, his voice low and serious. "Not for any reason. Do you understand me?" I nodded, too scared to argue. After they left, my mom tried to get me to eat some dinner, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about those red eyes, the way they had seemed to look right through me. Over the next few days, things got weirder. My dad started acting differently. He was distracted, quiet, spending a lot of time alone in his workshop. He'd always been a practical, level-headed guy, a mechanic who dealt in facts and tangible things, but now he seemed lost in thought, jumpy. Then the stories started circulating around town. Other people had seen things that night. Mrs. Keller, who lived about a mile down the road, told my mum she'd seen a bright light hovering above the trees, completely stationary. Old man Peterson, who ran the gas station, said he'd seen what looked like a spotlight or beam shining down into the forest from above. A week after our encounter, I came home from school to find my dad sitting at the kitchen table with a book I'd never seen before. It was old, with a worn leather cover and yellowed pages. When I asked him what he was reading, he quickly closed it, but not before I saw strange symbols and diagrams on the pages. "Just some old stories," he said dismissively, but later I heard him talking to my mom in hushed tones about prophecies and signs. "It's all connected," he was saying. "What the boys saw, what I found in the woods. It's all part of something bigger, something coming." My mom tried to calm him down, suggesting maybe he should talk to Pastor Miller about whatever was bothering him, but my dad just shook his head. "The church doesn't have answers for this," he said. "Nobody does." In the weeks that followed, my dad became obsessed with that book. I later found out he'd gotten it from a man who passed through town, occasionally selling odd items out of the back of his truck. Crystals, old books, strange artifacts. The book was supposedly a collection of prophecies and predictions, some dating back centuries. My dad started talking about the end of the world. Not in a religious way like the people who stand on street corners with signs, but in a quiet, certain way that was somehow more frightening. He installed extra locks on the doors and bought a generator. He started stockpiling canned food and water in the basement. Bobby and I tried to make sense of what we'd seen that day. We would talk about it when no adults were around, comparing details, making sure our memories matched. Sometimes I wondered if we had imagined the whole thing, if we'd somehow scared ourselves with shadows and normal forest sounds. But then I would remember those eyes, the way they had looked at me with an intelligence that was definitely not animal, and I knew it had been real. One night, about a month after the incident, I worked up the courage to ask my dad directly what he had found in the woods that night. We were alone in the garage where he was working on our car. He was silent for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. "Dad?" I prompted. He put down his wrench and looked at me. Really looked at me for what felt like the first time since that night. "Some things," he said slowly, are better left alone. What you and Bobby saw, it wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't natural. What about the glowing ball it was holding? I asked. A shadow passed over his face. That's what worries me the most, he admitted. Because I found something where you said you saw it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Carefully, he unwrapped it to reveal what looked like a piece of metal, no bigger than a quarter. It was silvery but had an iridescent quality, shifting colors when the light hit it from different angles. What is it? I asked. I don't know, he said, rewrapping it carefully. But it's not from around here, and it's not the only thing I found. He never told me what else he discovered in those woods that night. Whatever it was, it changed him fundamentally. The dad I knew before, practical, steady, grounded in reality, was replaced by someone who jumped at shadows and spent hours poring over that strange book, making notes and drawing connections between events that seemed random to everyone else. As for Bobby and me, we never went back to that spot in the woods. We didn't need my dad's warning to stay away. Some part of me knew that whatever had happened that day wasn't over, that those red eyes might still be out there, watching and waiting. Sometimes at night, I still wake up feeling like I'm being observed by something I can't see, something that knows me better than I know myself. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened, but I'm no closer to understanding it now than I was then. All I know is that on September 23rd, 1973, something impossible stepped out of the woods and into our lives, and nothing has been the same since. Story 8. It was July 29th, 1972. My buddy and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We were young and stupid, just looking to get away for a weekend, drink some beers, and enjoy the outdoors. We rode my motorcycle out there, a beat-up Yamaha that somehow managed to carry both of us and our camping gear. It wasn't much, but it was reliable. We arrived at Lake Mills in the afternoon. The place was pretty secluded, which was exactly what we wanted. There was this crude plywood lean-to about 100 yards off this dirt road. Nothing fancy, just some shelter in case it rained. No other campers were around, which seemed perfect at the time. God, I wish now there had been others nearby. We set up our little camp, nothing special, just our sleeping bags, a cooler with some food and beers, and a few other basics. We spent the rest of the daylight fishing, though we didn't catch much. As the sun started going down, we got a fire going. It wasn't very big, but it was enough to cook the one pathetic fish we caught and keep us warm as the temperature dropped. We stayed up late, just talking and drinking. I remember checking my watch around 2 in the morning and thinking we should probably get some sleep. The fire had died down to embers by then, and we were both pretty tired. We crawled into our sleeping bags, and I was out within minutes. I'm not sure what woke me up initially. Maybe it was some primal instinct, some part of my brain that sensed danger before I consciously registered it. But suddenly I was wide awake, and my heart was racing. The glowing embers of our fire had almost completely died out, casting just the faintest red glow around our campsite. I checked my watch. It was around 4 in the morning. Then I heard it. The sound of breaking sticks and rustling brush. At first I thought it might be a deer, or maybe a bear, which would have been bad enough. I lay completely still, straining my eyes to see into the darkness beyond our camp. That's when it emerged from the tree line, about 40 feet away. Even in the dim light, I could tell this was no bear, no animal I'd ever seen before. This thing was massive, walking on 2 legs. It moved deliberately, quietly for its size, but not silently. Each step brought the snap of a twig or the rustle of undergrowth. As it moved closer to our camp, I could make out more details, and my blood turned to ice. This thing, this creature, was easily 8 feet tall. It had a massive frame, broad shoulders, and was covered in what looked like matted brown fur. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, swinging slightly as it walked. The thing that struck me most was how it moved. Not like an animal, but not quite like a human either. There was purpose in its movements, intelligence. It wasn't stumbling around like some mindless beast. It was investigating, and it was heading straight for my motorcycle. I was frozen in place, afraid that the slightest movement would attract its attention. My sleeping bag suddenly felt like a trap. I couldn't run, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as this creature approached my bike. When it reached the motorcycle, it stopped. I swear I could hear it breathing, deep, heavy breaths. Then it bent over the bike, its massive form looming over the seat. Its chest must have been at least 2 feet above the seat. It reached out one enormous hand. I could see fingers, not paws, but huge fingers, and gently touched the handlebars. The gentleness of that touch was somehow more terrifying than if it had violently attacked the bike. It was examining it, curious. Those weren't the actions of an animal. There was understanding there. My friend was still asleep beside me, and I knew I had to wake him without making a sound. I slowly, painfully slowly reached over and put my hand over his mouth before gently shaking him. His eyes shot open in panic, and I could feel him start to struggle until our eyes met. I shook my head slightly, a silent plea for him to stay quiet. I nodded in the direction of the creature, and when my friend's gaze followed mine, I felt his whole body go rigid. His eyes widened in pure terror. I kept my hand firmly over his mouth, afraid he might scream or make some involuntary sound. The creature continued to inspect my motorcycle, running its massive hands over the seat, the tank, the handlebars. It seemed particularly interested in the mirrors, tilting its head as if trying to understand what it was seeing. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, the creature straightened up to its full height again. It stood there for a moment, completely still, and I had the terrifying thought that it might turn toward us next, but instead it slowly turned and walked back toward the brush it had emerged from, disappearing into the darkness. Neither of us moved a muscle. I kept my hand over my friend's mouth for so long, my arm started to cramp, but I didn't dare let go until I was absolutely certain that thing was gone. We lay there, barely breathing, for what must have been about 10 minutes, straining our ears for any sound of its return. Finally, when I couldn't stand the tension any longer, I removed my hand from my friend's mouth and whispered, "We need to get the fuck out of here." He nodded frantically, and we both began to move, as quietly as we possibly could. We didn't bother packing up our gear, sleeping bags, cooler, everything was left behind. The only thing that mattered was getting to my motorcycle and getting away from that place as fast as possible. We crept to the bike, every snap of a twig under our feet, sounding like a gunshot in the silent forest. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key into the ignition. I was terrified the noise of the engine would bring that thing running back. But staying seemed like an even worse option. I kick-started the bike, and the engine roared to life, shattering the silence of the forest. My friend jumped on behind me, and I didn't even wait for him to get properly seated before I took off, tearing down that dirt road like all the demons of hell were after us, and in a way, they were. We didn't slow down until we hit the main road, and even then, I kept the bike at top speed all the way back to town. We didn't say a word the entire ride. What was there to say? We'd both seen it. We both knew what it was, even if neither of us wanted to admit it. When we finally got back, it was just starting to get light. We went to my house since my parents were out of town that weekend. We sat in my kitchen, shaking, trying to process what we'd seen. That was a... My friend couldn't even say it. Bigfoot, I finished for him. We just saw a goddamn Bigfoot. He nodded, his face pale. What do we do now? Nothing, I said. Who the hell would believe us? We agreed to keep it to ourselves. What was the point of telling anyone? We'd be laughed out of town, labeled as attention-seeking liars or worse. Crazy. The problem came when my dad got home the next day. He wanted to know why all our camping gear was missing. I made up some story about leaving it at a friend's house, but he wasn't buying it. Finally, after he threatened to ground me for the rest of the summer, I told him we'd left it at the campsite because we got spooked by some noises in the night. He was furious. That gear had cost money, and he insisted we go back and get it right away. I tried every excuse I could think of, but he wouldn't budge. So that afternoon, we found ourselves driving back to Lake Mills in my dad's car. The whole way there, I felt sick to my stomach. What if that thing was still hanging around? What if there were more of them? By the time we pulled up to the dirt road leading to our campsite, I was nearly hyperventilating. "I'll wait in the car," I told my dad and friend. There was no way in hell I was going back into those woods. My dad started to argue, but something in my face must have stopped him. Instead, he and my friend walked down that dirt road while I locked myself in the car, jumping at every sound and watching the tree line like a hawk. They were gone for maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. When they finally returned with our gear, I nearly cried with relief. My friend looked as tense as I felt, his eyes darting around nervously, but my dad seemed completely oblivious to our terror. "I don't know what spooked you boys so bad," he said as he loaded our gear into the trunk. "It's a beautiful spot." Peaceful. We didn't respond. What could we say? That was 50 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I've never been camping again. Can't stand being in the woods after dark. My friend and I drifted apart over the years. I think we both wanted to forget what happened, and seeing each other just brought it all back. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there, still roaming the forests around Lake Mills. I wonder if it remembers us, the two terrified kids who fled in the night. I wonder if it ever thinks about that strange metal contraption it examined in the dark. And sometimes, in my nightmares, I see those massive hands reaching not for my motorcycle, but for me. Story 9. I've never told many people about this. It happened in the summer of '77, when I was just 10 years old. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see every detail like it was yesterday. My family had a small cabin near Missoula, right on the edge of Rattlesnake Wilderness in Montana. We'd spend most summers there, and I'd practically live on the back of my horse, Dusty. He was this gentle Palomino quarter horse, patient with me, which was important since I was still learning to ride properly. That day started like any other summer day. The air was warm, but not too hot, with that sweet pine smell that's everywhere in Montana wilderness. Mom had packed me a sandwich and an apple in a little sack tied to my saddle. "Be back before sunset," she'd said, like always. I'd ridden these trails dozens of times before, so nobody was worried. I set out around noon, following one of our usual routes that wound through the trees and eventually opened into this beautiful meadow full of wildflowers. Dusty and I had a favorite spot by a little creek where we'd stop so he could drink and I could eat my lunch. The trail that day was quiet, not even many birds singing. I remember thinking it was strange, but didn't really worry about it. When you're 10, you don't think about what silence in the woods might mean. We were about 2 hours into the ride when we approached the meadow. The trail curved around some rocks and then opened up into this clearing that was maybe 100 yards across, ringed by tall pines. Dusty was moving along at a steady pace when suddenly, and I mean instantly, he froze. Not the gradual stop horses usually make, but a complete, rigid halt. I felt him tense underneath me, every muscle in his body going stiff. His ears shot forward, and he made this soft snorting sound I'd never heard from him before. Something was wrong. Really wrong. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, patting his neck. But he wouldn't move. Not forward, not backward, just frozen. That's when I looked up, following Dusty's gaze toward the edge of the meadow about 30 feet ahead of us. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just trees, brush, the usual forest stuff. Then I noticed something dark behind one of the bigger pines, maybe 10 feet from the trail, something that didn't belong. It took me a few seconds to process what I was seeing. Half hidden behind a massive pine trunk was something. Someone. No, definitely not someone. Something. It was peeking out from behind the tree, just enough that I could see part of its face and shoulder. Dark brown or black hair covered what I could see of it. Not fur like a bear, hair more like really coarse human hair. The face I could see was flat and wide, with a prominent brow that shadowed its eyes. And those eyes, they were watching me, studying me, dark and intelligent in a way that made my stomach drop. I remember thinking it must be a bear at first, but even at 10, I knew bears didn't stand like that. This thing was upright, using the tree as cover, deliberately hiding most of its body. From the portion I could see, I knew it was massive, way taller than my dad, who was 6 feet. This thing had to be over 7 feet, maybe even 8. What struck me most was how perfectly still it was. The only movement was its slow, deliberate breathing, and those eyes tracking me. No growling, no sounds at all, just watching. Dusty was trembling beneath me now, his whole body shaking. I could feel his muscles twitching, ready to bolt, but something, maybe fear, kept him rooted to that spot. I wasn't exactly scared, at least not at first. It was more like my brain couldn't make sense of what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't anything I recognized from books or TV shows about wildlife. This wasn't a bear or a moose or anything I'd been warned about. The standoff probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like forever. Neither of us moved. Not me, not Dusty, not the creature. It just kept staring, half hidden behind that tree, like it was as curious about me as I was about it. I remember noticing details that seem weird to focus on now, like how its hair seemed to move slightly in the breeze, how its shoulder was so broad it stretched beyond the width of the tree trunk, how there was something almost human in the way it was deliberately concealing itself, showing intelligence and purpose. Then, without really deciding to, I gently pulled on Dusty's reins, turning him away from the meadow. I don't know if it was instinct or just plain luck, but I knew we needed to leave. Slowly. Dusty didn't need much convincing. He backed up, one careful step at a time, never taking his eyes off the thing by the tree. I kept my eyes on it too, afraid to look away even for a second. It still didn't move, just watched us retreat. Once we were around the bend in the trail, out of sight of the meadow, I leaned forward and whispered, "Go, Dusty, run." He didn't need to be told twice. He took off like a shot, racing down that trail faster than we'd ever gone before. I clung to his mane, ducking low branches, too scared to look back. We galloped all the way back to our cabin, Dusty's hooves pounding the dirt like drum beats. When I got home, I was shaking so hard I could barely dismount. Mom took one look at me and knew something had happened, but when I tried to explain what I'd seen, the words wouldn't come out right. Who would believe a kid who said they saw a giant, hairy man-thing in the woods? "Probably just a bear," Dad said, after I finally got the story out. "They can look mighty strange when they stand up." But his eyes didn't match his casual tone, and I noticed he checked that the cabin doors were locked that night. I didn't go riding alone for the rest of that summer. Actually, I barely went into the woods at all. The years passed. I grew up, went to college, eventually built my own house along the Clark Fork River, not far from where I saw that thing as a kid. I never saw it again, but I never forgot either. Then about 5 years ago, the sounds started. It was a warm night in July, probably around 2 in the morning. I was up late, couldn't sleep because of the heat. All the windows were open, and I was just sitting on the porch enjoying the cooler night air when I heard it. A scream, but not like any animal scream I've ever heard. It was deep and guttural, but powerful enough to carry across what must have been miles. It started low and built to this crescendo that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't a cougar or a wolf. I know those sounds. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong. The neighborhood dogs went crazy. Every single one, barking and howling like the world was ending. My own dog, who never barks at anything, was whining and pacing, trying to get inside the house. That wasn't the only time. All through that summer, maybe once a week, always between midnight and dawn, that same vocalization would echo across the valley. Sometimes it sounded closer, sometimes further away, but always the same distinctive sound. And always, the dogs would react like they were terrified. One night, my neighbor Tom came over the morning after a particularly loud screaming episode. "You hear that last night?" he asked, looking uncomfortable. I nodded. What the hell makes a sound like that? I could have told him what I thought it was. I could have told him about that day in '77 when I was 10 years old, but I just shrugged and said, "No idea." The thing is, I wasn't the first in my family to see something like this. About a year after the screaming started, I was visiting my grandparents who lived up in Swan Valley. We were sitting on their porch, and somehow the conversation turned to strange things they'd seen in their lives. Grandpa got real quiet for a minute, then said, "You know, back in the '40s, right after we built this place, I saw something I've never been able to explain." According to him, he was chopping wood near the river one evening when he spotted movement in the brush about 50 yards away. At first, he thought it was a bear, but then it stood up, way up. He described almost exactly what I'd seen, a massive, hair-covered figure, moving quickly but deliberately through the underbrush, watching him before disappearing into the denser forest. "Your grandmother thought I was crazy," he said with a little laugh. "But I know what I saw." Grandma didn't laugh. "I didn't think you were crazy," she said quietly. "I saw it too, a few weeks later, drinking from the river at dawn." I never told them about my own experience. Maybe I should have. Maybe it would have given us all some comfort to know we weren't imagining things. What strikes me now, looking back, is the similarity in all these encounters. Always in wooded areas with nearby meadows and rivers, always in the warmer months, always just a glimpse, a moment of connection, and then nothing. I've read books on Bigfoot sightings since then. Some sound ridiculous, clearly made up for attention, but others sound exactly like what happened to me, exactly like what my grandparents described. I don't know what's out there in the Montana wilderness. I don't know if it's the same creature I saw as a child that now screams in the night near my home. I don't know if it's the same thing my grandparents encountered nearly 80 years ago. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And when I hike or fish these days, I never go alone. And I always watch the tree line. Sometimes at night when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about those eyes watching me from behind that tree. Not angry, not threatening, just watching. Like I was as much of a curiosity to it as it was to me. Two species sharing a moment of recognition in the wilderness before going our separate ways. At least, that's what I tell myself when those screams echo across the valley on summer nights and all the dogs start to bark. Story 10. I've never told this story to anyone outside the group who was there that day. I still get chills just thinking about it, and I'm not someone who scares easily. This happened in July of 2008, when I was 16, and to this day, I haven't gone back to that stretch of the Huron River. It was hot as hell that day, mid-90s with that heavy Michigan humidity that makes your clothes stick to you. Me and 6 other friends decided to go swimming at this spot we'd found earlier that summer. It wasn't a public beach or anything, just this hidden gravel bar you could only reach by driving down this sketchy dirt road that wound through the woods for about half a mile. That's what made it perfect. No adults, no little kids, just us. The spot was beautiful in that wild, untouched way. The river bent around in a lazy curve, and the water was deep enough in the middle to dive safely. On our side was this gravel bar that sloped gently into the water, but across and upstream, the banks were steep and densely wooded. I mean densely wooded, Trees crowded right up to the edge of the water, their branches hanging over the river. Some of the trees were massive, old-growth stuff that had probably been there for 100 years. We'd been there maybe an hour, doing what teenagers do, splashing around, showing off for each other. There was this huge fallen tree that stretched out into the river from the bank. It had been there so long, the bark was smooth from everyone climbing on it. We'd take turns running along it and jumping into the deeper channel. The girls would sunbathe on the gravel, while the guys tried to outdo each other with flips and dives. I remember I was floating on my back in the water, just letting the current push me gently downstream, when I noticed something odd. I couldn't hear anything except the splashing and talking from my friends. No birds, no insects, nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then it really hit me. The woods had gone completely silent. If you've spent any time outdoors, you know that's not normal. There's always something making noise. Birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling. But there was absolutely nothing. Just this heavy, waiting silence. I remember getting this weird feeling in my stomach, like when you're at the top of a roller coaster about to drop. I flipped over and started treading water, looking around at the trees. "Hey," I called out to my friends. "Is it weird that it's so quiet?" A couple of them stopped what they were doing and listened. "Yeah, that is weird," said one of the guys. "Maybe there's a storm coming." We looked up at the sky, but it was clear blue, not a cloud in sight. That's when we heard the first splash. It came from upriver, around the bend where we couldn't see because of the trees. It wasn't loud, just a distinctive plunk sound, like something breaking the surface. "Probably just a fish jumping," someone said, and we went back to swimming. Maybe 2 minutes later, there was another splash, definitely closer this time, and then a third splash, closer still. One of the boys, who was sitting on the fallen tree, said, "Sounds like someone throwing rocks." We all looked upriver, straining to see around the bend. No one else was supposed to be out there. The property was private on both sides of the river, and we were technically trespassing, though the owners never seemed to care. I was still in the water, about 15 feet from the gravel bar when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. An arm, a long, thick arm covered with dark hair, broke the surface of the water. The hand opened wide. I remember being shocked at how human-like it was, but so much bigger, and slapped down on the water with a crack that echoed off the trees. I froze, couldn't move, couldn't speak, just stared at the spot where the arm had disappeared. Then more of it emerged. Shoulders rose above the surface, broad and powerful. Then a head. God, that head. It had this wide, flat face with a nose that was almost flush with its features. The eyes were deep set, under a heavy brow ridge. They looked intelligent. That's what scared me most. They weren't animal eyes. They were assessing us, calculating. Someone screamed, I think it was one of the girls, and suddenly everyone was moving. My friends in the water started swimming frantically for the gravel bar. I snapped out of my paralysis and swam harder than I've ever swum in my life. I looked back once while swimming. The creature was standing upright in the water, which came up to about its chest. Based on how deep that channel was, at least 5 feet, this thing had to be well over 8 feet tall. Its shoulders and chest were massive, barrel-shaped, with those long arms hanging down, swinging in these slow, deliberate arcs. We scrambled onto the gravel, slipping and sliding in our panic. One girl fell and scraped her knee badly, but she didn't even seem to notice. Another friend grabbed her arm and yanked her up. The creature rose higher out of the water as we watched in horror, now standing fully upright in the channel. I could see muscles rippling under the dark hair that covered its body. Then it threw back its head and let out this sound. God, I still hear it in my nightmares. It wasn't a scream or a growl. It was this deep, rolling roar that seemed to echo along the entire river valley. You could feel it in your chest, like when you stand too close to the speakers at a concert. The sound had this weird quality to it, almost like it contained words, but not in any language I'd ever heard. That roar sent us running up the bank away from the water. I remember my feet slipping on the wet gravel, the panic making it hard to breathe. We were all yelling, some crying as we stumbled away from the river. One guy was hyperventilating so badly, another friend had to practically drag him along. I glanced back one more time. The creature remained in the water, watching us retreat. It didn't try to come onto the gravel bar, which was the only thing I'm thankful for. If it had charged us, I don't think any of us would have made it. As we reached the tree line at the top of the bank, I saw it turn and move back toward the deeper part of the channel. One of the guys who was behind me later told me he saw it stride quickly along the opposite bank before disappearing into the trees. He said it moved with this bizarre agility, covering ground faster than a person could run, yet somehow doing it silently. The quarter-mile back to our cars felt like miles. We ran the whole way, crashing through underbrush, not even caring about the path. My lungs were burning, and my wet clothes were heavy and sticking to me, but the fear pushed me forward. One girl was sobbing uncontrollably. Another had this 1,000-yard stare that was almost scarier than what we'd seen. When we reached the cars, we piled in without even drying off. No one spoke much on the drive back into town. What was there to say? We'd all seen it, but none of us had the words to process what it was. Later that night, we met up at one guy's house. His parents weren't home, which was good because we were all still freaking out. We tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Someone suggested it might have been a bear, but we all knew bears don't stand upright in deep water or have hands that look almost human. Someone else said maybe it was people playing a prank, but the size of the thing ruled that out completely. No human is that big or moves that way. Two of the braver guys went back the next day in the afternoon. They told us they found the gravel bar looking disturbed, with what might have been track impressions in the mud near the bank. Wide, deep depressions that didn't match any animal they knew, but they didn't stay long. They said the whole time they were there, they felt like they were being watched. They kept hearing branches snap in the woods across the river, but never saw anything. We never reported it to anyone. Who would believe us? We'd been trespassing, and honestly, who would take a bunch of teenagers seriously? We'd be the local joke by the end of the day. I've done research since then, read about similar encounters in Michigan. The Upper Peninsula especially has a history of sightings, but nothing that matches exactly what we saw. Something that was comfortable in deep water, that used the river to hunt or travel. It's been 15 years, and I still wake up sometimes hearing that roar. I still feel those eyes watching us from across the water. I still wonder what would have happened if it had decided to come ashore. I don't go swimming in rivers anymore. I stick to pools where I can see the bottom, and whenever I'm driving and see those brown signs for the Huron River, I get this sick feeling in my stomach. Whatever was in that river that day, it wasn't supposed to exist. But it does. And sometimes I wonder how many other people have seen it, and like us, were too afraid or embarrassed to tell anyone. Story 11. I've been hesitant to share this for years. People tend to dismiss what they don't understand. And honestly, I've tried to dismiss it myself. But what happened to me that day in November of 2009 still gives me chills when I think about it, especially when I'm alone in the woods. I'm a lifelong hunter. Been doing it since I was 12, following my dad through the Pennsylvania woods every season. Nothing about the outdoors scares me, or at least nothing used to. It was November 30th, 2009. Deer season had just opened, and I'd taken the day off work to get out to my favorite spot in the state game lands, north of Glendale Lake in Cambria County. I know those woods like the back of my hand. Been hunting there for over 15 years, and I've never experienced anything remotely like what happened that morning. I left my house around 3:30 a.m. It was cold as hell that morning, maybe 20 degrees, with a light dusting of snow on the ground from the night before. Perfect tracking conditions. The moon was just a sliver, and the sky was clear and full of stars. I remember checking the weather forecast the night before. No wind, which is ideal for hearing deer movement. I parked my truck at the designated lot around 4 a.m. and hiked in about a mile to my favorite stand. It's nestled between two ridges in a natural funnel where deer often travel. I've taken a buck from that spot almost every year, so I was feeling pretty good about my chances. The woods were dead silent that morning. Usually you hear something, an owl, a raccoon, something rustling in the leaves, but there was nothing, just complete stillness. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, that should have been my first warning. As I approached my tree stand, maybe 50 yards out, I caught a whiff of something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a musky, animal-like odor that hit me like a wall. At first, I thought maybe a deer had died nearby, or perhaps it was a bear that had marked the area. But this was different, stronger, more, I don't know how to describe it other than primal. It wasn't rotting meat, and it wasn't quite like bear musk either. It was something I'd never smelled before, like wet dog mixed with skunk, but more pungent, more wild. I shined my flashlight around, thinking I might spot whatever had left that scent, but saw nothing. The smell was so strong, I actually covered my nose with my jacket for a minute. It's embarrassing to admit, but my heart was already beating faster than normal. Something about that smell triggered a response in me that I couldn't control, like some ancient part of my brain was screaming, "Danger." Still, I'm not one to spook easily. I figured it was just some animal that had passed through recently. So I continued to my stand, climbed up, and got settled in. It was around 4:35 a.m., still a good hour and a half before legal shooting light. I switched off my headlamp to let my eyes adjust to the darkness and just sat there, listening to the silence. That's when I heard it. About 50 yards away, in the direction of the ridge to my west, I heard footfalls. Heavy footfalls, the kind that make the ground vibrate slightly. At first I thought deer, but immediately knew better. Deer move delicately, with light steps. Even a big buck doesn't sound like this. This was heavy, deliberate, slow. Whatever it was big, really big. Each step was accompanied by the sound of leaves compressing and twigs snapping under significant weight, and the pattern, that's what got to me. It wasn't four-legged movement, it was bipedal, 2 feet, like a person walking, but heavier than any person I've ever heard. My breath caught in my throat. I froze completely still, not even daring to shift my weight on the stand. The footsteps continued, slow and methodical. Crack, pause. Crack, pause. Along with the footsteps came the sound of branches breaking. Not small twigs, but the distinct sound of thick branches being pushed aside or broken. I strained my eyes trying to see something, anything in the pitch darkness, but it was useless. The night was moonless, and even with my eyes adjusted, I couldn't make out more than vague shapes of trees closest to me. The footsteps stopped. There was a moment of complete silence that seemed to stretch forever. My heart was hammering so loud in my ears, I was certain whatever was out there could hear it. Then it happened. A vocalization that still echoes in my nightmares. A high-pitched, rising whoop sound that started low and climbed in pitch. It wasn't a screech or a scream. It was controlled, intentional, like a call. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. A few seconds passed, then another one, identical to the first. Whoop! Rising in pitch, echoing slightly through the trees. I've been in these woods my whole life. I know every animal sound from these parts. This wasn't a coyote, wasn't a bobcat, wasn't an owl or any bird. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before or since. The closest thing I can compare it to is maybe if a person was trying to mimic a monkey's call, but deeper, more resonant, with a chest behind it that no human could produce. I sat there, my rifle forgotten in my lap, just trying to process what I was hearing. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the sides of my stand. After those 2 calls, the footsteps resumed, but they were moving away now, deeper into the forest, away from my position. Crack, pause, crack, pause. I could track its progress just by sound as it moved at least 100 yards further into the woods, the footfalls getting fainter until they disappeared completely. But the smell remained. That musky, wild smell hung in the air for hours, even as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky around 6:30 a.m. That smell was still there, though fainter. When it was finally light enough to see, I scanned the area with my binoculars. Nothing. No sign of whatever had passed by. Part of me wanted to climb down and look for tracks, but another part, a smarter part, kept me rooted to that stand. I stayed there until noon, not seeing a single deer, not even squirrels or birds. The woods remained unnaturally quiet all morning, like everything was hiding. I didn't fire a shot that day. When I finally did climb down, my legs were stiff from sitting so tensely for hours. I debated whether to check for tracks where I'd heard the footsteps, but decided against it. Call it cowardice if you want. But something in me didn't want confirmation of what I already knew in my gut. I practically speed-walked back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder. I've never felt that kind of relief hitting pavement again. For weeks afterward, I told myself it was a bear. Had to be. Maybe it was walking on its hind legs for some reason. Maybe the vocalization was just something I'd never heard before. Maybe the smell was just a coincidence. But deep down, I know better. I've read accounts since then. Descriptions of Sasquatch encounters, the heavy bipedal footsteps, the wood knocking, the distinct whooping calls, the overpowering musky odor. It all matches what I experienced. I've always been a skeptic about Bigfoot. Always thought people who claimed to see it were attention seekers or mistook bears for something else. Without a body or clear photo, I never believed. Part of me still doesn't want to believe. But that morning changed something in me. I can't explain what I encountered in any conventional way. Whatever was walking through those woods wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal species from Pennsylvania. I went back to those woods the following season, but to a different spot, miles from my old stand. I couldn't bring myself to return to that exact location, and even in the new spot, every unexpected sound had me on edge. I still hunt, still enjoy the outdoors. But something fundamental changed for me that November morning. I no longer feel like I'm at the top of the food chain when I'm in the deep woods, and I never hunt alone anymore. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. Hell, some days I try not to believe it myself, but I know what I heard, what I smelled, what I felt. Something was out there. Something big that walks on 2 legs and makes sounds no known animal makes. Something that doesn't want to be seen. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and can't sleep, I wonder, what if it had come closer to my stand? What if it had seen me? What would have happened? Those thoughts keep me awake more often than I'd like to admit. I've never told this story publicly before today. Most of my friends and family don't know. My wife knows something happened that made me change my hunting habits, but even she doesn't know the full story. It sounds too crazy, too unbelievable. But it happened. November 30th, 2009, a day that fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness I thought I knew so well. Story 12. I've never told many people about what happened to me on September 10th, 1975. Most wouldn't believe me anyway, and those who might would probably think I'm crazy. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I was 23 at the time, living in Peace River, Alberta. It's beautiful country up there, dense forests, rolling hills, and the kind of silence that city people pay good money to experience. That day, my friend Mike and I decided to visit this old cemetery on a hillside just outside of town. We weren't doing anything weird, just exploring. Mike was into photography and wanted to capture some of the older headstones for a local history project. The day started normal enough. Clear skies, warm for September, perfect for being outdoors. We parked at the base of the hill and hiked up to the cemetery. It took about 20 minutes to reach it, following this narrow dirt path through the trees. We spent maybe an hour wandering around the graves, Mike taking his photos while I just soaked in the atmosphere. It was around 2 in the afternoon when everything changed, and I mean everything. The first thing I noticed was the silence. If you've spent any time in the woods, you know they're never actually quiet. There's always something. Birds calling, leaves rustling, insects buzzing. But suddenly, it all stopped. Complete silence. The kind that makes your ears ring because they're searching for any sound at all. I remember looking at Mike to see if he noticed it too. He was still focused on his camera, adjusting the lens for another shot. But I couldn't shake this feeling crawling up my spine. My neck hairs stood straight up and I felt like something was watching me. You know that feeling, right? When you just know eyes are on you. "Mike," I said, "something feels off." He glanced up, looked around, then shrugged. "Just need to use the bathroom," he said. "Gonna head back to the car. You coming?" I needed to go too, but I'd noticed these little outdoor toilet facilities at the edge of the cemetery property. "I'll use the washroom here and catch up," I told him. Mike nodded and started down the hill while I walked toward the toilet, one of those pyramid-shaped outhouses, probably 8 or 9 feet tall at the peak. As I got closer, the feeling of being watched intensified. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. When I was about 15 feet from the outhouse, I saw a shadow move on the far side. Not like a cloud passing overhead. This was a solid shadow, shifting along the ground. Then I heard it, this heavy, outgoing breath, not like a person sighing, but something much larger exhaling. And the smell hit me all at once, this musky, wild stench that burned my nostrils. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, heart hammering against my ribs. Then I saw it step partially into view beside the outhouse. I can't emphasize enough how tall this thing was. The structure was 8, maybe 9 feet high, and this creature stood maybe 7.5 feet tall next to it. I only caught a glimpse of its profile, but it was enough to know this wasn't human, not even close. I immediately abandoned any thoughts of using the washroom. My bladder suddenly didn't matter at all. I backed away slowly, then turned and started walking. Not running, walking, back toward the cemetery and the path down to the car. Every step felt like moving through molasses. I was terrified of making any sudden movements. I'd made it maybe 30 feet when I heard Mike's voice from down the hill. "Get back to the car. Now." His voice was tight with panic, and when I turned to look at him, I saw he was staring wide-eyed in my direction. Not at me, but behind me. When I turned around, the terror that hit me was unlike anything I've ever experienced before or since. It wasn't standing anymore. The thing was on its front arms, with its rear end in the air, pushing itself along the ground behind me. It was barely 4 feet away, its head low to the ground, apparently sniffing at my trail, like a dog tracking a scent. But it was no dog. Its hair was this darkish blonde light color, not thick like a bear's. It was sparse on the body, but thicker on the legs and arms. The face had very little hair, though the head had more, and the hair itself looked extremely coarse, reminding me of a horse's mane in winter. But the face, God, the face. It was ape-like, but not quite. There was something disturbingly intelligent in its features. Our eyes met, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. I saw recognition in its eyes, not the mindless stare of an animal, but something that understood what it was seeing, something that was making decisions. I don't remember deciding to run. My body just took over. One moment I was frozen in place. The next I was sprinting down the hill toward the car, my lungs burning and my legs pumping faster than I thought possible. Behind me, I heard movement. Heavy, fast movement. I risked a glance back and nearly stumbled at what I saw. The creature had risen up and was chasing after me, not on all fours anymore, but upright, standing straight like a human. Its arms swung at its sides as it ran, and it was fast, much faster than something that size should be able to move. And then it screamed. The sound still haunts my nightmares. Not a roar like a bear, not a howl like a wolf. It was a scream of rage that sounded almost human, but distorted and amplified through a throat that wasn't made for human sounds. I reached the car just as Mike was starting the engine. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, screaming at him to go. The tires spun in the dirt as Mike floored it, and we fishtailed onto the narrow road that led back to the main highway. Through the back window, I watched the creature follow us for about 50 yards down the hillside before it finally stopped. It stood there at the edge of the tree line, still upright, watching our car disappear down the road. Its arms hung at its sides, fists clenched. Even from that distance, I could feel its anger. The drive back to town is a blur in my memory. Mike kept asking me what happened, what I saw, but I couldn't form coherent sentences. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I threw up twice on the way home. When we finally reached my house, I was still in shock. My mother took one look at me and knew something terrible had happened. I broke down and told her everything. She called someone, I don't know who, maybe local police or a game warden, and the next day someone went to investigate. All they found were a few tufts of coarse hair caught on some branches near the outhouse. They told my mother it was probably just a bear, but I know what I saw. Bears don't stand upright and run like humans. They don't have expressions of intelligence and rage in their eyes, and they certainly don't scream like that. For months afterward, I couldn't sleep without the lights on. I refused to go hiking or camping. Even now, almost 50 years later, I get anxious in dense forests. The sound of wind through trees sometimes makes me freeze in place, listening for that heavy breathing. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, seen the blurry photos and shaky videos. Most seem fake or misidentified bears. But sometimes I'll read an account that describes that same unnatural silence in the woods, that same musky smell, that same intelligent gaze, and my skin crawls all over again. I don't know what I encountered that day in Peace River. I don't have a fancy name for it or a theory about where it came from. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for some reason it was interested in me. Maybe it was territorial and I had wandered too close to its den. Maybe it was curious about what humans were doing in its woods, or maybe it had darker intentions. What haunts me most is wondering how many other encounters like mine have happened over the years. Encounters where people weren't lucky enough to have a car waiting nearby. People who didn't make it back to tell their stories. The woods behind that cemetery never made the news for any disappearances that I know of. I moved away from Peace River the next year, partly because of a job opportunity, but mostly because I couldn't bear being that close to those woods anymore. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what happened. Could it have been a bear with mange that made its fur look patchy? Could the upright running have been a trick of the light and my panicked mind? Could the intelligence I saw in its eyes have been my own fear reflected back at me? But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The way it moved, the way it tracked me, the way it stood and ran. No known animal behaves that way. And the scream. I still hear that scream in my darkest dreams. I've never gone back to Peace River. I don't know if that creature is still there, still roaming those woods. Part of me hopes someone else has seen it and documented it properly. Another part hopes no one else ever has to feel the terror I felt that day. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, I've stopped caring what people think about it. But if you're ever in the woods and everything suddenly goes silent, if the birds stop singing and the insects stop buzzing, don't ignore it. That silence isn't empty. It's a warning. Story 13. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened back in the summer of '75. This wasn't some campfire story or something I heard secondhand. I lived it. I saw it with my own eyes. And to this day, I can't explain it. I was living in Leadville, Colorado then. For those who don't know, it's this old mining town tucked away in the Rockies at over 10,000 feet elevation. Beautiful country, but isolated. The kind of place where the wilderness starts right at the edge of town and stretches for miles. My foster son, Tyler, had gotten a job with the U.S. Forest Service that spring. Good kid, early 20s, responsible. His main job was maintaining all the timber signs throughout the district. You know, those big wooden markers that point to trails, camping areas and ranger stations. Pretty straightforward work. Check the signs, repair damaged ones, replace the ones that couldn't be fixed. About a month into the job, Tyler came home looking confused. He told me that 3 signs along the western routes had been completely torn down. Not just knocked over, but literally ripped off their posts. I didn't think much of it at first. Figured it was probably just some teenagers with too much time and energy. Probably just vandals, I told him. You know how people can be. Tyler shook his head. No, you don't understand. These aren't little trail markers. These are the big timber signs. Solid wood, 8 feet tall. Each one weighs over 100 pounds and they're anchored at least 3 feet into the ground with concrete. That got my attention. Those signs were built to withstand Colorado winters. Heavy snow, high winds, the works. They weren't something you could just yank out of the ground without serious equipment. Over the next few weeks, more signs went down. Always in the same area, always with the same pattern. Tyler's supervisor was getting frustrated, assuming it was vandalism, but couldn't figure out how anyone was doing it. They even had rangers drive by more frequently, but never caught anyone. What was weirder was how the signs were being destroyed. They weren't being cut with saws or hit with vehicles. From what Tyler described, it looked like someone had grabbed the signs and just twisted them until they snapped. The wood was splintered in a way that suggested immense force applied by hand, not tools. By mid-July, the Forest Service was fed up. They decided to try something different. They coated several of the replacement signs with a thick layer of automotive grease, the kind that's nearly impossible to wash off. The idea was that if vandals tried to mess with the signs, they'd get covered in grease and be easy to identify. 3 days later, one of those greased signs was down. Tyler was part of the crew sent to investigate, and what they found chilled him to the bone. Clear as day in the grease was a massive handprint, not just large, enormous. The palm alone was nearly twice the size of a man's hand, with fingers that were thick and powerful looking. His supervisor took photographs and measurements. The handprint was approximately 14 inches from wrist to fingertip. Whatever had left it had hands bigger than any human Tyler had ever seen. That evening when Tyler got home, he was pale. He laid the photos on our kitchen table and just stared at them. What could do this? He asked me. What has hands like a person but this big? I'd been hearing rumors. Leadville wasn't a big place, and word gets around. Hikers reporting strange noises in the forests. Campers finding their sites disturbed during the night. A couple of hunters swore they'd seen something massive moving through the trees at dusk. Something that walked on 2 legs. I didn't tell Tyler what I was thinking. Didn't want to scare him with stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever people were calling it. But the thought was there, sitting between us at the table like an uninvited guest. I don't know, was all I said, but maybe we should keep our eyes open. About a week later, early August now, we decided to do some night fishing at Turquoise Lake. It's this beautiful alpine lake about 5 miles west of town, surrounded by forest. We finished up around 11 at night and were driving back on this dirt road that winds below the lake. The road was rough, all washboard and potholes. so we were going slow, maybe 15 miles per hour. Tyler was driving, and I had the window down, enjoying the cool mountain air. That's when we heard it. To our right was a small stream that ran from the lake down into the valley. Something was moving in it, splashing, not like a fish jumping or the constant flow of water over rocks. This was rhythmic, deliberate, like something big was walking through the water. We stopped the truck. Tyler cut the engine, and we just listened. The splashing continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I grabbed the spotlight from under the seat and pointed it toward the stream. Nothing, just water reflecting the beam. "You hear that?" Tyler whispered. I nodded. We sat there for maybe 5 minutes, completely silent. Then, the moment I switched off the spotlight, we heard it again. Splash, splash, splash. I quickly turned the light back on. The splashing stopped immediately. Whatever was down there was smart enough to freeze when the light hit it. "It only moves when the light's off," Tyler said, his voice tight. We played this game 3 or 4 times. Light on, silence. Light off, splashing. Whatever it was trying to move without being seen, using the darkness for cover. Finally, I kept the light off. The splashing continued, moving upstream now, getting fainter. Tyler started the truck and we continued driving, both of us scanning the darkness ahead. We'd gone maybe half a mile when it happened. Something huge burst out from the trees on our left and ran across the road about 100 yards ahead of us. The headlights caught just a glimpse of it, a massive, dark shape, moving on 2 legs, incredibly fast. It crossed the entire width of the road in what seemed like 2 strides and disappeared into the sagebrush meadow on our right. Holy shit! Tyler slammed on the brakes. "Did you see that?" My heart was hammering in my chest. Yeah, I saw it. What I'd seen didn't compute in my brain. It was man-shaped but massive, tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and thick, not fat, but solid, powerful. The kind of build that makes a linebacker look small. We sat there for a minute, the truck idling, both of us staring at where it had disappeared into the sagebrush. Then we heard it, heavy footsteps crashing through the vegetation, moving away from us at incredible speed. "We should go," Tyler said. "No!" I grabbed his arm. "I want to see." It was stupid looking back, but curiosity is a powerful thing. Tyler reluctantly drove forward until we reached where the figure had crossed. I jumped out with the spotlight and my hunting knife, as if that would do any good against what we'd just seen. The meadow was filled with sagebrush about 3 feet high, silvery green in the moonlight, and cutting through it was a trail of crushed vegetation, like something heavy had plowed right through it. The trail led straight toward a line of pine trees, about 200 yards away. I followed the trail for maybe 20 feet before common sense kicked in. Whatever made this path was big, fast, and probably not something I wanted to meet in the dark. As I turned to go back to the truck, I heard a sound from the direction of the trees, a deep, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't human either. The hairs on my neck stood up. I swung the spotlight toward the tree line. For just a split second, I caught it. A massive, dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, looking back at me. It was only visible for a moment before it stepped sideways and vanished into the forest. But that moment was enough. It stood upright, had broad shoulders and a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. It was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair, and even from that distance, I could feel it watching me, intelligent, aware. I ran back to the truck and jumped in. "Go," I told Tyler. "Now." We drove straight home without stopping, not saying much. What was there to say? We'd both seen something that shouldn't exist. The next morning, we went back with daylight on our side. The trail through the sagebrush was still there, a clear path where the brush had been crushed down by something heavy. We followed it to the trees and found something else. Footprints, not clear ones. The ground was too hard for that, but depressions in the pine needle carpet that suggested a foot much larger than mine, and I wear a size 12. Tyler quit his job with the Forest Service 2 weeks later, said he didn't feel comfortable working alone in the woods anymore. Can't say I blamed him. The strange thing is, after that night, the sign destruction stopped completely. It's like whatever had been tearing them down realized it had been spotted and moved on. I've thought about that night thousands of times over the years. Tried to convince myself it was a bear, maybe, walking on its hind legs, or some elaborate prank. But I know what I saw. The speed it moved, the way it stood, the intelligence it showed by freezing when the light hit it. No bear does that. No human is that size. I've never told many people this story. Who'd believe it? But I know what we saw that night below Turquoise Lake. Something that isn't supposed to exist. Something that watches from the forest edges and leaves handprints bigger than any man's. Something that tears down signs that take 3 men to install. I still go fishing in Colorado sometimes, but never after dark. And I always feel like I'm being watched when I'm in those woods. Because maybe I am Story 14. I never was a big believer in those Bigfoot stories people tell around campfires. Sure, I'd watch those shows on TV where they go looking for evidence, but I always thought it was just entertainment. I mean, if these creatures were real, wouldn't we have solid proof by now? Trail cameras, bones, something. That's what I used to think anyway. But what happened that day in Idaho back in August of 2002 completely changed everything I thought I knew about what's possible. My brother-in-law Tom and I had been planning this fishing trip for months. We both needed a break from work and family stress, so we packed up our gear and headed to the Snake River in Idaho. The spot we chose was pretty remote, that was the point. We wanted somewhere quiet, where the fish would be biting, away from other people and the noise of everyday life. It was a beautiful summer day. I remember how perfect the weather was. Not too hot, clear blue skies, just a light breeze. We'd been fishing since early morning and had caught a few decent-sized trout. Nothing spectacular, but enough to make the trip worthwhile. We were planning to grill them up for dinner back at camp. Around mid-afternoon, we were standing about 20 yards apart along the riverbank. Tom was downstream from me, focusing on a deep pool where he'd spotted some movement. I was closer to where our gear was piled, trying my luck in the faster-moving water. That's when I first noticed something odd. The woods on the opposite bank had gone completely silent, and I mean completely silent. If you've spent any time outdoors, you know there's always background noise, birds, insects, leaves rustling. But suddenly, nothing. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the whole forest. I remember looking over at Tom to see if he'd noticed it too. He was standing absolutely still, his fishing rod forgotten in his hands, staring across the river. That's when I knew something wasn't right. "You hear that?" I called over to him. He nodded slowly. "I don't hear anything. That's the problem." We both stood there feeling uneasy when there was a heavy splash from the other side of the river. It wasn't like a fish jumping or a branch falling in. This was substantial, like something big had entered the water. At first, we couldn't see anything through the thick brush on the opposite bank. The Snake River isn't exactly narrow at that point. Maybe 70 or 80 feet across where we were standing. The current was strong too, especially in the middle. Then the brush parted, and I swear to God, what stepped out makes my hands shake even now as I type this, 20 years later. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, walking upright on 2 legs. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. The thing had a full-grown deer draped across its shoulders. A deer, not a fawn, but a full-sized deer, and it was carrying it like I might carry a bag of groceries. I remember thinking my eyes must be playing tricks on me. There's no way I was seeing what I thought I was seeing, but Tom saw it too. I glanced over at him, and his face had gone completely white. The creature stepped into the river and began wading across. Now, this part of the snake has a current that would knock a grown man off his feet in seconds. I've seen it happen to experienced fishermen who misjudged their footing. But this thing, it walked through that current like it was nothing more than a gentle stream. The water barely seemed to affect it. As it got closer to the middle of the river, I could make out more details. Its body was covered in dark, wet hair. Not fur exactly, but more like hair matted down from the water. It had this heavy brow ridge, deep-set eyes, and a wide, flat nose. Its jaw was broad and powerful looking, and the smell, God, the smell. Even across the distance of the river, when the wind shifted our way, there was this overwhelming musky odor mixed with something worse, like decay or rotting meat. I gagged when I first caught a whiff of it. The creature was about halfway across when it turned its head and looked directly at us. I'll never forget those eyes, dark, almost black, but with this strange reddish glint to them when the sunlight hit them just right. It didn't seem startled or surprised to see us. It just acknowledged our presence. I couldn't move. It was like my feet had grown roots into the ground. Tom was the same way, completely frozen in place. We weren't hiding or anything. We were standing right there on the open riverbank, completely visible. But the creature didn't seem threatened by us at all. It kept wading through the water, the deer still balanced on its shoulders. The deer's legs dangled down, swaying slightly with each step the creature took. I remember thinking how impossibly strong this thing must be to carry that weight so effortlessly through such strong currents. When it reached our side of the river, it climbed up the bank about 30 yards downstream from where we were standing. Water cascaded off its body as it emerged. It was even more massive on land than it had appeared in the water. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, its arms longer than a human's should be. It stood there for a moment, dripping, its chest heaving slightly from the exertion of crossing the river. Then it did something that still haunts me. It turned and looked directly at us again. This time I could have sworn its eyes actually glowed, not reflected light, but an actual dull red glow from within. It held our gaze for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. The creature reached up with one massive hand and adjusted the deer on its shoulders, securing its grip. Then, without any sign of hurry or concern, it turned toward the tree line. Before disappearing into the forest, it paused and looked back at us one last time. There was intelligence in that look. Not animal intelligence, but something that understood exactly what we were and was making a decision about us. And then it was gone, vanishing into the trees with barely a sound despite its size and burden. Tom and I stood there in complete silence for I don't know how long. Minutes? Maybe longer. Neither of us spoke. What could we possibly say? We'd just seen something that couldn't exist, something that defied everything we thought we knew about the world. Eventually, I remember Tom clearing his throat. "We should head back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just nodded. We gathered our fishing gear mechanically, moving like sleepwalkers. We didn't run. That's the strange part. You'd think we would have sprinted back to our truck, but we didn't. We just moved quietly, deliberately, constantly scanning the tree line where the creature had disappeared. The walk back to our truck was about a mile. We didn't say a single word the entire way. I kept expecting to catch another glimpse of the creature, to hear it crashing through the underbrush nearby, but there was nothing. The forest had returned to normal. Birds were singing again, insects buzzing. It was as if nature had reset itself after holding its breath while that thing passed through. When we reached the truck, Tom unlocked it, and we both got in. We sat there for a long time before he finally started the engine. "What did we just see?" he asked, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "I don't know," I answered honestly, but we both saw it. We debated whether to report it to someone, a park ranger maybe, or the local sheriff, but what would we say? That we saw an 8-foot-tall, hairy man creature carrying a deer across the Snake River? Who would believe that? In the end, we decided to just head home. We cut our trip short by 2 days. Neither of us wanted to stay out there anymore, not with that thing somewhere in the same woods. The drive home was mostly silent. We tried a few times to talk about what we'd seen, to make sense of it, but the conversation always faded quickly. How do you process something like that? There's no frame of reference. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. I kept seeing those eyes in my dreams, that intelligent, evaluating gaze, the way it had looked at us like it was deciding something. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had let us go, that it had made a conscious choice not to bother with us. Tom and I have talked about it a few times over the years. We've both looked into Bigfoot sightings, read accounts from other people who claim to have seen similar creatures. Some details match up with our experience, but nothing quite captures what we saw that day. I've never told anyone else about this until now. Not my wife, not my kids, not my closest friends. Who would believe it? I can barely believe it myself, and I was there, but I know what I saw. I know it was real. And I know that there are things out there in the wilderness that science hasn't categorized or explained. Things that most people will go their whole lives without encountering. Sometimes I think about going back to that spot on the Snake River, just to see if I could find any evidence. Footprints, broken branches, anything to prove to myself that I didn't imagine it all. But then I remember those eyes, that overwhelming physical presence, and I know I never want to be that close to such a creature again. What bothers me most, even after all these years, is the deer. Why was it carrying a deer? Where was it taking it? Was it bringing the kill back to others? The thought that there might be more of these creatures out there, living in secret, hunting, surviving, it's both fascinating and terrifying. I've spent the last 20 years trying to make sense of what happened that day. I've read scientific papers about undiscovered primate species, about how much of our wilderness remains truly unexplored. I've gone down internet rabbit holes about Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings, but nothing has given me a satisfactory explanation. All I know for certain is what Tom and I saw that August afternoon in 2002, a creature that shouldn't exist, carrying a deer across a river that should have swept away any normal man, looking at us with eyes that contained something more than animal awareness, and then vanishing, leaving us with a memory that neither of us can fully explain or forget. To this day, whenever I'm in the woods and things go quiet, I feel my heart rate spike. I scan the trees, half expecting to see that massive figure emerge again, and I wonder if, somewhere out there, it remembers us too. Story 15. I still remember that camping trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened back in the summer of '66. I was 12 years old, part of Troop 42 out of Butte. We were doing our annual summer expedition in Deer Lodge National Forest, about 30 miles from home. I've spent my whole life in Montana, been hunting since I was 8, and know what bears and mountain lions sound like. What we encountered that night was something else entirely. There were 8 of us boys, plus our scoutmaster, Mr. Peterson. We'd hiked about 5 miles into the backcountry that day, setting up camp in a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines. It was pretty remote, just the kind of trip we always looked forward to. We'd spent the day fishing, practicing our knots, and earning our wilderness badges. After dinner, hot dogs and beans cooked over the campfire, we sat around telling ghost stories. Typical boy stuff. Mr. Peterson warned us not to get too spooked since we were miles from civilization. The only thing to fear out here is not being prepared, he told us, quoting the scout motto. Man, if he only knew what was coming. We all bedded down around 10 o'clock. The older boys had their own tents, while us younger ones were paired up. I was sharing with my buddy Tommy. We were too excited to fall asleep right away, whispering about the fishing we'd do tomorrow at the creek we'd crossed about a mile back. I must have finally dozed off around 11. Not sure exactly what time it was when I first heard it. Probably somewhere around 1 in the morning. At first, it was just the sound of something moving around the perimeter of our camp. Nothing unusual about that. Deer and other critters often get curious about campsites. But then the sounds changed. This wasn't the light footfall of a deer or even the heavier steps of a black bear. These were deliberate, heavy footsteps, the kind that make the ground vibrate slightly. And they were getting closer. I nudged Tommy. "You hear that?" I whispered. He was already awake, lying completely still. "Yeah," he breathed. "What is it?" "Dunno, maybe a bear." We lay there listening as whatever it was moved closer to the campsite. Then we heard a different sound, our gear being disturbed. Something was going through our backpacks, which we'd left hanging from a tree branch to keep food away from bears. That's when I heard Kevin, in the next tent over, whisper loudly, "Guys, something's out there!" The footsteps continued, heavier now, and we could hear items being moved around. Our cooking pot clanged against something, and one of the canteens made a dull thud as it hit the ground. Tommy grabbed his flashlight. I did the same, my hand shaking so bad I could barely hold it. We were both breathing hard, trying to stay quiet. From another tent, I heard Steve's voice. "Mr. Peterson, there's something in the camp." I could make out Mr. Peterson's tent zipper opening slowly. Then his hushed voice, "Boys, stay in your tents. It's probably just a curious bear." But it didn't sound like a bear. Bears aren't that methodical. They knock things over, make a mess. This sounded purposeful, like someone was searching for something specific. That's when we heard a loud crash. Sounded like our cooler being knocked over. Mr. Peterson's flashlight beam cut through the darkness outside our tents, sweeping across the campsite. "All right, whatever you are, move along now," he called out, trying to sound authoritative, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence followed for maybe 5 seconds, then a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. It was deeper, more guttural. I'd never heard anything like it before or since. "Tommy, I'm scared," I whispered. "Me too," he admitted. Then we heard Mr. Peterson gasp. His flashlight beam had frozen on something at the edge of our camp. "Oh my God," he said, barely audible. That was it. We couldn't stand it anymore. Almost in unison, all of us boys unzipped our tents and scrambled out, flashlights in hand, pointing them in the same direction as Mr. Peterson's beam. And there it was. Standing at the edge of our campsite was something I still struggle to describe. It was massive, towering really, standing upright on 2 legs like a man, but it had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its entire body was covered in dark hair, looked black in the darkness, but might have been a very dark brown. The hair was long and shaggy around the shoulders, shorter on the limbs. Its face was partially shadowed, but what I could see wasn't like anything in any wildlife book. It had a pronounced brow ridge, deep-set eyes that reflected our flashlight beams with a reddish glow, and a flattened nose. Not a snout like a bear, more like a really primitive human face, but not human at all. For a moment it just stood there, staring at us. I remember feeling like those eyes were looking right through me. Not with anger or hunger like a predator, but with intelligence. That's what scared me the most. It wasn't behaving like an animal. It was watching us, assessing us. It was holding something, one of our backpacks, just holding it casually, like a person would. When all our flashlights hit it, it didn't bolt like a startled animal. It slowly turned, still upright, and began walking away. Not running on all fours like a bear would if surprised, but walking deliberately on 2 legs, with long strides that ate up the ground. "Holy," one of the older boys whispered. "Nobody move," Mr. Peterson said, his voice shaking. We stood frozen, watching as this enormous figure moved away from our camp, heading up a ridge about 50 yards away. It never looked back, never changed its pace, just walked away with purpose, disappearing over the ridge and into the tree line. The silence afterward was deafening. We all stood there, flashlights still pointed at where it had vanished, nobody daring to speak for what felt like minutes. Finally, Kevin broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" His voice cracked. "Language," Mr. Peterson said automatically, but his heart wasn't in it. He looked as shaken as we were. It wasn't a bear, Tommy said beside me. Bears don't walk like that. No, Mr. Peterson agreed quietly. It wasn't a bear. None of us went back to sleep that night. We huddled around the fire that Mr. Peterson rebuilt, talking in hushed voices about what we'd seen. Some of the boys suggested it might have been a man in a costume playing a prank, but we were miles from anywhere. And who would lug a costume that realistic into the wilderness just to scare some random Boy Scouts? Besides, no costume could explain the height, the fluid movement, the way it carried itself, and no human could make those footsteps. They were too heavy, too powerful. As dawn broke, I remember feeling both relieved and apprehensive. Daylight made everything seem less terrifying, but it also meant we could investigate. I want to see if it left tracks, Steve said after we'd eaten a nervous breakfast. Mr. Peterson hesitated, then nodded. We'll all go together. Nobody wanders off alone. Understood? We followed the direction the creature had taken toward the ridge. The ground was mostly needle-covered forest floor, but as we approached an area with softer soil near the base of the ridge, we found them, footprints. Unmistakable, impossible footprints. They were shaped exactly like human feet. 5 toes, an arch, a heel, but enormous. Had to be at least 16 inches long and very wide. The impression was deep too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Those aren't bear tracks, Tommy whispered beside me. Bears have claws. He was right. These prints had no claw marks. They were just giant human-like feet. We followed the tracks up the ridge and down the other side, where they continued into a dense stand of trees. The prints were consistent, always bipedal, always the same enormous size. Mr. Peterson stopped us after about a quarter mile. That's far enough, boys, he said firmly. We need to head back and break camp. But don't you want to know what it is? Kevin asked. Mr. Peterson looked at the tracks, then back at us. Sometimes the woods keep their secrets, he said quietly. And maybe that's for the best. We packed up in record time. Nobody wanted to stay any longer than necessary. The hike out was tense, with all of us constantly looking over our shoulders. We stuck close together, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling bush. When we finally reached the trailhead where our transportation was waiting, I remember the flood of relief. The entire ride back to Butte. We couldn't stop talking about what we'd seen. Mr. Peterson was unusually quiet. When we got back to town, he gathered us all together before our parents picked us up. Boys, he said seriously, about what happened out there, people might not understand. You mean we shouldn't tell anyone? Asked Tommy. Mr. Peterson sighed. I'm not saying that. Just be prepared for folks to think you're making it up. What we saw doesn't fit into most people's understanding of the world. He was right. My parents listened politely when I told them, then suggested it was probably just a bear. My teacher the following school year actually laughed when I mentioned it for a summer experiences essay. After a while, most of us stopped talking about it, but I know what I saw. We all do. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a costume, wasn't any animal I've ever seen in any book. Those footprints, so human-like but impossibly large, they told the truth. Something walked out of those woods on 2 legs that night. Something that shouldn't exist but does. I'm 50 years older now. I've spent my life in Montana, hunted every season, hiked thousands of miles through our wilderness, never seen anything like it again, but I still won't camp in Deer Lodge National Forest. Some places, once you've seen what's really there, you don't go back. And some memories, no matter how much time passes, never lose their edge. I don't know what to call what we encountered that night in '66. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you want to give it. All I know is it was real. 8 boys and 1 adult saw it. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, I still hear those heavy, deliberate footsteps in my dreams. And I wake up wondering if it's still out there, walking through the Montana wilderness on those impossible human-like feet. Story 16. I still can't wrap my head around what happened to me last November. I've been hunting all my life, but that day in the Ozarks changed everything. I've hesitated to share this because I know how it sounds, but I need to get it off my chest. November 12th, 2017. That date is burned into my memory. I'd been scouting a promising area in the Ozark National Forest for about a week before the actual hunt. Found this perfect game trail with deer tracks everywhere, fresh droppings, even some rubs on the smaller trees. Classic signs that told me this was the spot. I set up my pop-up blind the day before, just a simple camo job, nothing fancy, but enough to break up my outline and keep my scent somewhat contained. That morning I woke up at 4:30, way before sunrise. There's something about those pre-dawn hours that feels almost sacred when you're hunting. The world's still asleep and you're moving through it like a ghost. I drove out to my spot, parked about 3/4 of a mile from my blind, and hiked in with just my essentials: rifle, day pack with some water and snacks, extra layers because Arkansas weather can turn on you fast. I reached my blind around 5:15 and settled in. It was pitch black still, that deep darkness you only experience in the woods, away from city lights. I didn't use my headlamp much, just enough to find the blind and get inside without making a racket. Then I just sat there, letting my eyes adjust, listening to the forest wake up. Sunrise came slowly, that grey half-light filtering through the trees. I could start to make out shapes, the trunks of oaks and hickories, some underbrush, the contours of the game trail. The normal morning sounds started up: birds calling, squirrels rustling, the occasional distant crow, all the usual stuff. For the first few hours, everything was normal. Around 7, I saw a doe with a yearling about 80 yards out, but they were just passing through, not coming close enough for a shot. I wasn't disappointed. It was early in the day, and seeing deer movement was a good sign. Then around 9 o'clock, something changed. It wasn't sudden, more like a gradual shift in the atmosphere. First thing I noticed was the silence. If you've spent any time hunting, you know that silence in the woods isn't natural. There's always something making noise: birds, insects, leaves rustling, but everything just stopped, like someone hit a mute button on the forest. That's when my skin started crawling. That primal part of your brain that evolved to keep you alive was screaming that something was wrong. I felt it before I heard anything. This sense of being watched, of something being close. I froze in my seat, barely breathing, my hand tightening on my rifle. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from behind my blind. Not a deer, not a person. Something big and heavy, making the ground thump with each step. I remember thinking maybe it was a black bear. They're in the Ozarks, though not common. But these steps sounded different, more purposeful, more upright. The footsteps circled around to the left side of my blind, slow and methodical. Then they stopped. For maybe 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. I was holding my breath, my heart hammering so loud I thought whatever was out there must hear it. Then my entire blind exploded with movement as something slammed against the side of it. The whole structure shook violently, the flexible poles bending inward from the impact. I nearly pissed myself, not gonna lie. Before I could even process what was happening, this roar tore through the air. Not a bear roar, not any animal sound I've ever heard in 20+ years of hunting. This was deeper, louder, more purposeful, like it was meant to terrify, and it did. It vibrated through my chest cavity. I felt it physically move the air in my lungs. The blind shook again as whatever it was struck it a second time harder. I could hear the poles creaking under the strain. I was frozen, gripping my rifle, but too shocked to even raise it. The thing moved again, circling the blind. I could hear its breathing now, heavy, rhythmic snorts. Through the mesh window, I caught glimpses of it between the trees. Just flashes, really, not a clear view. But what I saw, God, I still see it when I close my eyes. Massive. Taller than any man. Wider through the shoulders than makes sense. Dark hair covering its body. Not fur exactly, more like a shaggy coat. And its face. Just for a split second I saw it. Heavy brow, deep-set eyes that looked intelligent, aware. It approached the blind again, this time directly in front of me. The mesh window between us felt like nothing. I was shaking so hard I couldn't have aimed my rifle if I wanted to. It roared again, and the sound in that confined space was deafening. My ears were ringing afterward. Then it started hitting the blind again. Not random strikes. It was methodical, like it was testing the structure's strength. One of the poles bent so far I thought it would snap. The fabric stretched and strained. I was sure any second the whole thing would collapse on me. And the smell. I'll never forget that smell. This overpowering, musky stench, like wet dog but 100 times stronger, mixed with rotting vegetation and something else. Something primal. It was so strong I could taste it, making me gag. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The creature circling, roaring, hitting the blind, me inside, paralyzed with fear, certain I was going to die. I couldn't see my watch, couldn't focus enough to count seconds. Time stopped making sense. Then, after one final earth-shaking roar that left my ears ringing, it moved away. I heard those heavy footsteps retreating, the vegetation crushing under its weight. Even after I couldn't hear it anymore, I didn't move. I sat there, rifle clutched to my chest, for at least 30 minutes, maybe longer. When I finally gathered enough courage to peer through the window again, there was nothing there. Just the silent forest. But the silence was different now. Heavier, charged with something I can't explain. I waited another 15 minutes before I could make myself leave the blind. My legs were so wobbly I almost fell when I stood up. When I finally stepped outside, I saw what it had done. The fabric of the blind was stretched in places. One of the poles was bent at an angle that would make it unusable again. Around the blind, the ground was disturbed, dirt kicked up, leaves scattered, and there were impressions in the soil. Not clear footprints, the ground was too hard for that, but depressions where something incredibly heavy had stood. I measured the distance between some of the stride marks with my hands, wider apart than any human could step. Way wider. I abandoned the blind right there. Left it standing with my empty water bottle and granola bar wrapper still inside. I grabbed my rifle and day pack and got the hell out of there. Didn't even try to be quiet anymore. I just wanted distance between me and that place. The hike back to my truck felt like it took forever. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow looked like it might hide that massive shape. I kept smelling that stench, though I don't know if it was still in the air or just burned into my memory. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of there, driving way too fast on those forest roads. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. That smell clung to my clothes all the way home. It was so bad, my wife made me strip in the garage before I could come inside. I stood in the shower for almost an hour, scrubbing until my skin was raw, but I swear I could still smell it for days afterward. Some of my hunting buddies tried to tell me it was just a bear, or maybe some guys playing a prank, but I know better. I've encountered black bears before. This wasn't that. It was too big, too strong, too deliberate in its actions. It wasn't trying to get food or defending cubs. It was sending a message, warning me away. As for it being people, no way. No human could make those sounds or have that kind of strength, and that smell. No one could fake that. I haven't been back to that part of the Ozarks since. Haven't even been able to get myself to go hunting at all this season. I keep seeing those brief glimpses of it through the trees. That massive shape, those eyes. I keep hearing that roar that seemed to come from somewhere primeval. I don't know what I encountered that day. I don't have a name for it. All I know is it was real. It was intelligent, and it wanted me gone. And I listened. Story 17. I've never fully recovered from what happened last April. I've barely told anyone about this, not even my closest friends, because honestly, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I've been a farmer in the Ozarks for nearly 15 years. It's quiet out here, peaceful. Just me and my livestock, some dairy cattle and a small herd of goats I keep for cheese and clearing brush. Nothing exciting ever happens, which is exactly how I like it. That changed on April 18th, 2018. It was a Wednesday night, warm for April. I'd gone to bed around 10 after checking on the animals one last time. Everything was normal. The goats were settled in their pen inside the barn, the cattle quiet in their stalls. I remember thinking how calm everything felt. I woke up at exactly 1:27 in the morning. At first, I couldn't figure out what had jolted me awake, but then I heard it. My goats were screaming. Not just their normal bleating, but full-on shrieking. The kind you only hear when they're terrified beyond reason. And my cattle, Jesus, they were bawling and slamming against the wooden rails of their pen with such force I could hear the cracking from inside my house. Something was very, very wrong. I jumped out of bed, threw on my boots, and grabbed the shotgun I keep by the door. I didn't even bother with a shirt, just ran out in my pajama bottoms and boots. The night was clear, moon was bright, but I grabbed my flashlight anyway. As I approached the barn, the animal sounds got louder, more frantic. I've had coyotes come around before, even dealt with a mountain lion once, but this was different. The animals were absolutely losing their minds. Then I noticed something else, a smell. God, that smell. Like roadkill that's been baking in the sun for days, mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I hesitated at the barn door, shotgun raised. The smell was coming from inside. My hands were shaking as I pushed the door open. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. There, in the center of my barn, was something massive. It was hunched over because it was too tall to stand upright under the ceiling beam. My barn ceiling is almost 9 feet high at its tallest point, and this thing had to bend to fit. Its shoulders were enormous, literally spanning the width between two support posts that are about 4 feet apart. The creature was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, more like long matted hair, almost black, but with reddish-brown patches. In the dim light of my flashlight, I could see it was tangled with twigs and what looked like dried mud. But its face, I'll never forget its face as long as I live. It had this heavy brow ridge that shadowed its eyes, and a nose that was wide and flat, almost like a gorilla's, but different. Its jaw was massive, powerful looking. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something in between, something that shouldn't exist. One of its hands, and they were hands, not paws, was gripping one of the rail posts of the cattle pen. Its fingers were wrapped completely around the 6-inch thick post, and I could hear the wood actually creaking under the pressure. Those fingers had to be at least twice as long as mine, ending in thick, dirty nails that looked more like claws. My goats were in complete panic, slamming themselves against their pen, trying to get as far away from this thing as possible. My cattle, normally stubborn and hard to move, were pressed against the far side of their pen, packed so tightly together I was afraid they might crush each other. I stood frozen in the doorway, shotgun half raised, unable to process what I was seeing. That's when it made a sound, a deep, rumbling grunt that I didn't just hear. I felt it vibrate through the wooden floor, up through my boots and into my chest. It was so deep and powerful that some dust fell from the rafters. Then it moved. It took a step forward, and I could see its full height as it momentarily straightened up, its head nearly brushing against the low rafters of the far end of the barn. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. I started backing away, my finger trembling on the trigger of my shotgun, though some part of my brain was telling me this would be as effective as shooting at a tank with a BB gun. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out even the sounds of my panicking animals. That's when the strangest thing happened. The creature suddenly turned its head, looking past me and out into the darkness beyond the barn door. Its posture changed. It seemed almost alert, wary. Then it stepped back into the shadows at the rear of the barn, where my flashlight couldn't reach. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I backed out of the barn, turned, and ran back to my house faster than I've ever moved in my life. I locked all the doors and windows, sat in my living room with my shotgun across my lap, and waited for dawn, too terrified to even call anyone. When the first light of morning finally came, it took every ounce of courage I had to go back to the barn. I was convinced I'd find destruction, maybe even dead animals. What I found instead was almost more unsettling. The animals were alive, but still visibly traumatized. The goats huddled together in a corner, still trembling. The cattle were unusually quiet, watching me with wide eyes as I entered. But the barn itself was largely undisturbed. No broken equipment, no smashed pens. But there were signs it hadn't been a nightmare. Deep grooves in one of the wooden posts where the creature had gripped it, 5 distinct finger marks dug into the hard oak, and outside, in the soft dirt near the back of the barn, footprints. Massive footprints with 5 clearly defined toes, easily twice the size of my boots. I wear a size 11. I followed the tracks to the edge of the woods behind my property, where they disappeared into the underbrush. They led straight toward the deepest, most remote part of the forest, an area locals generally avoid because of the steep ravines and dense vegetation. As I stood there staring into those woods, a terrible realization hit me. This thing, whatever it was, could have easily killed me. It could have torn me apart like tissue paper if it wanted to. Hell, it could have killed all my animals. But it didn't. It chose not to. That's what keeps me up at night. Not just the knowledge that this creature exists, but that it made a conscious decision to leave me alone, like it recognized me as another thinking being and decided to spare me. It's been over a year, and I've never seen it again, though sometimes at night I catch that same sour smell on the breeze. I've reinforced my barn, installed motion sensor lights, and bought a stronger gun. Not that I think it would do much good if that thing decided to come back. I've researched online, read accounts from other people who claim to have seen similar creatures. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others have regional names for it. Whatever it is, I know what I saw wasn't a bear or any known animal. It moved with too much intelligence, too much purpose. Sometimes I wonder if it lives in those woods, watching my farm. Other times I convince myself it was just passing through. But deep down, I know it's still out there. The strangest part, I'm not as afraid as I should be. Don't get me wrong, I'm still terrified of encountering it again. But there's also this weird sense that if it had wanted to hurt me, it would have. It had every opportunity that night. A few weeks after it happened, I mentioned something vague about hearing strange noises to an old-timer at the feed store. He got real quiet, then told me there have been stories about mountain devils in these parts going back generations. Said his grandfather claimed to have seen one back in the 1930s. I didn't tell him what I saw, but the look he gave me made me think he knew anyway. I've thought about selling the farm and moving somewhere else, somewhere more populated. But this is my home, my livelihood. And honestly, where would I go? If these things are out there, who's to say they're just in the Ozarks? So I stay. I keep my shotgun closer, I check my livestock more frequently. And every night before bed, I look out toward those woods and wonder if it's looking back at me. I don't know what it was doing in my barn that night. Maybe it was hungry, maybe just curious. Maybe it was seeking shelter, but I do know one thing for certain. It let me live, and I still don't understand why. Story 18. I don't normally share this kind of stuff online, but after 3 years of keeping it to myself, I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. Maybe I'm not alone in this. I bought this beautiful piece of land in Dent County, Missouri, back in 2002, 80 acres of pure wilderness heaven, right on the border of Mark Twain National Forest. It was everything I dreamed of owning. A mix of oak forest, some open grazing areas, a small section of pine forest with this old logging road cutting through it, and a creek that flows when it rains. Perfect hunting land, perfect weekend getaway spot. I built a small hunting cabin there, nothing fancy, just somewhere to crash when I wanted to escape city life. From the beginning, though, something felt off about the place. Don't get me wrong, I love my property, but there were these sounds I'd hear sometimes, vocalizations that didn't match up with anything I knew lived in those woods. I've been hunting since I was 12. I know what coyotes sound like. I know fox calls, owl hoots, the screams of bobcats, even the occasional mountain lion scream, though officials insist they're not, in Missouri anymore. These sounds weren't any of those. I'd mention it to my buddies, and they'd just laugh it off. Probably just a weird echo, they'd say, or maybe you're just hearing things after too many beers. I stopped bringing it up, but I never stopped hearing those sounds. April of 2005 is when everything changed. I took a long weekend, Friday through Sunday, to head out to my property for some peace and quiet. Spring in the Ozarks is beautiful. Not too hot yet, the ticks aren't out in full force, and the forest is just waking up from winter. Friday started out totally normal. I arrived around noon, opened up the cabin, aired it out a bit, spent the afternoon doing some maintenance, cleared some brush around the cabin, fixed a loose board on the porch steps, that kind of thing. After dinner, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sunset through the trees. It was peaceful. Perfect. As night fell, I noticed how bright the moon was. It was about 3/4 full, hanging in a cloudless sky, casting enough light that I could see pretty far into the tree line without a flashlight. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how lucky I was to have this place. Around 10:30, something changed. It was so sudden that at first I thought something might be wrong with my hearing. The forest just went silent, completely silent. No crickets, no frogs from the creek, no distant owl hoots, nothing. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole forest. The silence was so complete, it made my ears ring. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that when everything goes quiet at once, it usually means a predator is nearby. But what kind of predator silences an entire forest? I went inside, grabbed my flashlight and my .45, then returned to the porch. I swept the beam around the edge of the clearing, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. The silence stretched on for what seemed like forever, though my watch told me it was about 45 minutes. That's when I heard it. From somewhere southwest of my cabin came 2 or 3 whooping sounds, followed by the most ungodly noise I've ever heard in my life. It was like a rumbling screech, part roar, part scream, so loud it seemed to vibrate the air. It didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard, not a bear, not a mountain lion, nothing that should exist in Missouri or anywhere else. My blood ran cold. I froze on the porch, flashlight beam forgotten in my hand. Before I could even process what I'd heard, another sound answered from the southeast, the same kind of vocalization, whoops followed by that terrible screech roar, but slightly different in pitch, like a different individual. They called back and forth like this 4 times. With each exchange, I could tell they were moving. First, they seemed to be getting closer together, both approaching my cabin from different directions. Then, they seemed to move away from each other again. The sounds were so loud that they had to be coming from something massive, something with lungs bigger than anything that's supposed to live in these woods. Between the second and third series of calls, I heard something else that turned my fear into full-blown terror. 3 distinct, deliberate knocks, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Bang! 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 It came from nearby, maybe a couple hundred yards from the cabin. A few seconds later, 3 answering knocks came from much further away. Bang, bang, bang. I'd heard rumors about tree knocking before, stories from other hunters, tales told around campfires. But I never believed them, not until that moment. After the 4th exchange of those horrific screech roars, everything went silent again. This silence lasted maybe 5 minutes before gradually the normal nighttime sounds of the forest returned. Crickets started chirping again. An owl hooted in the distance. It was like whatever had scared the forest into silence had moved on. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the .45 on the nightstand beside me and left the lights on. Every noise made me jump. I told myself I'd pack up and leave in the morning, but when daylight came, I felt stupid. The forest looked normal. Birds were singing. It was hard to believe that anything strange had happened at all. I spent Saturday hiking around my property, looking for, I don't know what. Signs, I guess. Tracks, broken branches, anything unusual. I didn't find anything concrete. Just a few places where it looked like something large had moved through the underbrush, but it could have been deer. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I'd stop to rest or take a drink of water, the hair on the back of my neck would stand up like someone, or something, was staring at me from just beyond my line of sight. Saturday night, I debated driving back to the city, but it was already getting dark, and the thought of navigating those back roads at night suddenly seemed more dangerous than staying put. I double-checked that all the windows and doors were locked, kept my gun close, and tried to convince myself that I was overreacting to normal forest sounds. I managed to doze off around 10, only to jerk awake sometime later to that same eerie silence that had preceded the previous night's events. No crickets, no frogs, nothing but my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. I lay there in bed, straining to hear anything, clutching my pistol so hard my hand hurt. My bedroom window faces west, toward the deeper part of the forest. The curtains were open, and with the moon so bright I could see the silhouettes of the trees against the night sky. That's when it happened. The window beside my bed, which is about 4 feet off the ground, went completely dark. Something outside was blocking the moonlight, something big enough to cover the entire window. It wasn't just a shadow moving past. The window went dark and stayed dark for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. 2 to 5 seconds of complete blackness, like something was standing right outside, looking in. And the smell, God, the smell, like wet dog, but worse. Musky, wild, with an undertone of something rotten. It came seeping through the closed window, so strong I could taste it. My finger tightened on the trigger of my pistol. I was too terrified to move, to call out, to do anything but lay there, waiting, certain that at any moment the window would shatter and something would reach in for me. Then the darkness moved away. Moonlight filtered back through the window. I finally found the courage to move, to fumble for the switch on the bedside lamp. Light flooded the room, and I nearly cried with relief. I don't know how long I sat there, gun trained on the window, before I worked up the nerve to check outside. When I finally did, flipping on the porch light and peering cautiously around the curtain, there was nothing there, no massive shape, no monster, nothing but the silent forest and the moonlight. I didn't sleep again that night. When morning came, I immediately went outside to look for footprints or any other evidence. The ground around that side of the cabin is mostly leaf litter, which didn't show clear prints. I found some areas where the leaves seemed disturbed, but nothing conclusive. I packed up and left within the hour, drove straight home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel the whole way. It's been 3 years, and I still own that property. I still go there sometimes, but never alone. And I never stay overnight anymore. I've never heard those sounds again, or experienced anything like that night. I've researched everything I can find about the forests of Missouri, trying to find a rational explanation. Bear? The size might fit for what blocked my window, but the vocalizations don't match any bear I've ever heard. Mountain lion? Again, the sounds are all wrong, and they're not big enough to block out an entire window. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. Some combination of normal forest noises and shadows playing tricks on me. But then I remember that smell, that wild, musky odor. And I know whatever was outside my cabin that night was real. I don't know what it was. I don't want to put a name to it, but I know it was there, and I know it was watching me.